SCP-058 Heart of Darkness. Item number SCP-058 Object Class Keter. Special Containment Procedures. SCP-058 is to be kept in isolation in a 5 meter by 5 meter by 5 meter containment chamber at all times. Walls are to be constructed of 3 meters, 10 feet, of reinforced heat-resistant steel, backed with a further 10 meters, 33 feet, of reinforced concrete. SCP-058 is to be fed a live cow every 3 days. Maintenance is to be conducted every 60 minutes while SCP-058 is dormant, and every 15 minutes when SCP-058 is active. Under no circumstances is SCP-058 to be allowed out of its containment area. SCP-058 is to be audio recorded at all times. No personnel are to listen to SCP-058 for more than 30 minutes at a time. In case of escape, facility is to be considered compromised and detonation of on-site nuclear weaponry is to commence. To date, SCP-058 has been responsible for the death of at least 149 Class D personnel and 14 agents at its current site. Description: SCP-058 resembles a bovine heart with 4 arthropod-like legs used primarily for movement, and 4 tentacles of adjustable length covered with razor-sharp spines. It has a single sharp stinger on its rear, where the hole for the superior vena cava would be in a typical organ. SCP-058's tentacles can be whipped to a distance of 3.2 meters, 10.5 feet, at speeds in excess of 320 kilometers per hour, 200 miles per hour. SCP-058 is extremely hostile and will use every opportunity afforded to it to inflict damage on its surroundings. SCP-058 has been shown to be highly resistant to trauma and should be approached with caution, even when apparently incapacitated. SCP-058 is highly mobile and capable of rapid movement on both horizontal and vertical surfaces. It has been recorded reaching a speed of approximately 90 kilometers per hour, 55 miles per hour in short bursts, covering distances up to 200 meters, 656 feet, and has the ability to accelerate from 0 to 90 kilometers per hour, 55 miles per hour, in less than 2 seconds. It has been shown to use its tentacles for increased leverage and stability, as well as utilizing them to pull itself to other surfaces at high speeds. SCP-058 speaks in a human voice, though no method of producing sound has been observed in its physiology. It speaks with vocal tone and accent of an elderly British male with a slight lisp and deep voice. SCP-058 talks constantly, regardless of conditions, even when attacking. SCP-058's voice and pace of speech are unchanged. The speech of SCP-058 lacks any detectable correlation to events, persons, or exterior locations involved with SCP-058. See transcript of interview 058-04. Notes: SCP-058 was first encountered at Site Redacted as it came out of data expunged. SCP-058 was extremely hostile and appeared to be very agitated. Initially, SCP-058 attacked Site Redacted, which resulted in the death of redacted faculty and redacted agents. SCP-058 went on to attack the nearby town of Redacted, resulting in the death of over redacted citizens and the destruction of 70% of the surrounding buildings. Post-breach analysis determined a majority of the deaths are attributable to fire and fire-related injuries, resulting from a wide spread of stinger fluid by SCP-058 from a large structure. This is also blamed for a majority of structural damage. Redacted by SCP-058 accounts for only 8% of total deaths, with major evidence data expunged. SCP-058 was finally contained after being crushed and incapacitated by a large amount of masonry from a building that had collapsed on top of it. SCP-058 was then extracted and transported to Redacted by agents and MTF teams. SCP-058 was contained at Redacted for 3 weeks, during which it made minimal attempts to move, attributed both to physical damage and bloating from Redacted during the initial breach incident. Testing during this period was limited, with SCP-058 still maintaining a high threat level even in its impaired state. SCP-058 breached containment on redacted during an attempted transfer to an SCP containment site, causing multiple deaths and injuries. SCP-058 was eventually incapacitated by Agent Redacted, who managed to subdue SCP-058 by running it over with an M1 tank, pinning it beneath the armored vehicle. SCP-058 was subsequently secured and transported to Armed Biocontainment Area 14. Addendum: SCP-1175 Containment Team has observed significant agitation in SCP-1175-2 on a number of dates that coincide with prolonged breaches of SCP-058's containment. Additionally, personnel assigned to AI-2471-GH2's maintenance have reported inexplicable heart palpitations during similar timeframes. Investigation into possible connections is pending RESA approval. Transcript of Interview 058-04 SCP-058. I had dreams of the Queen Wonders that lived inside the hearts of love, and silent treatments of all the elderly that I knew were once whole. Dr. Johnson, what is your name? I seek the revelations of all that the holy told to the unwise in the dreams of cold embers in sunlight that fade across lakes of black blood, and snakes that eat the loaves of children from lamb trees in autumn. What is your name? Endless suffering is the woe of ignorant men who never lack to seek the depth of their own hearts and only see the wealth of a poor world suffering to flay its own back in knife wounds of silver and brutal gladness. Where are you from? The nightmare is a dream to the nameless slug that wanders across minefield and the remains of deer and kings. Personnel D-067. This is some creepy ass. D-067 cuts off into screaming. Nightshade is shadows and all honest blinks that sort through the bile of newborn plagues. Instant warmth as a mother's milk in dreams before anything was ever evil. Personnel D-067 continues screaming. Let him go! In seconds the sun is beating like drums in all hearts. Eat the ear of noise. Personnel D-067 screaming is cut short abruptly. The sensual violence of lust is all the assurance you will ever need to know the worth of life. End log. Dr. Conrad Scott has spent his life working for the Foundation, but he feels like it's all been for nothing. He used to work with SCP-1981 trying unsuccessfully to decipher its cryptic warnings about the future. Now he does the same with SCP-058, futilely struggling to extract some meaning from its endless rambling. He was going nowhere, accomplishing nothing, until one day, when 058 uttered that hateful phrase, "the drooling path." Conrad doesn't know what it means, if it means anything at all, but years ago he heard SCP-1981 say the same thing, and that can't be a coincidence. For the first time, he's got a lead, and if the Foundation won't follow it, he'll do it himself. This is the record of Dr. Scott's dangerous, off-the-books investigation and his desperate attempt to untangle the sinister leads that tie these anomalies together. Let's see what he finds. Listen to the heart. He's gonna listen to the heart. Dr. Conrad Scott rubbed his eyes and groaned. He wasn't supposed to be listening to SCP-058. He'd already gone over the 30-minute limit in the containment procedures and would probably start vomiting cicadas or something at any moment. Dr. Scott chuckled to himself, because after close to 20 years in the memetics division, people inevitably develop a very odd sense of humor. Cousin Johnny had nothing to do with 058. Dr. Scott could tell because of the subtle differences in their word salad. Johnny usually talked about food and gory violence, while 058 spoke in far grander but equally nonsensical terms. Their tones were different too. Johnny was friendly and casual, but 058 sounded more formal, like it was reading poetry. Maybe it was, or was trying to, from whatever alien dimension its true consciousness inhabited. You could say 085 was Dr. Scott's pet project, insofar as any car-sized heart monster could be considered a pet. The so-called Heart of Darkness fascinated Dr. Scott, though not because of its incredible destructive capabilities. They had plenty of unkillable, inexplicable monsters at the Foundation, but only one of them had been spewing vaguely nihilistic word salad 24/7 for the last redacted years. And every apocalyptic non sequitur, every doom-laden run-on sentence had been recorded. Dr. Scott had heard maybe a third of the recordings. The 30-minute restriction made it impossible for him to listen to the whole thing, especially since he hadn't been assigned to 058 until many years after its containment. That fool Johnston had been working on it from the start, but he wouldn't have known what to do with a word salad if you gave him a fork and a typewriter. Dr. Scott laughed again, flipping to the interview log in 058's file. Johnston had made a fool of himself, asking it its name and where it was from. Creatures like that, they didn't understand concepts like names and places, at least not the way we do. Johnston was of the opinion that 058 didn't understand anything. He thought the speech was just some bizarre byproduct of its redacted origin. and it was nothing more than a mindless beast, a faster 682 that occasionally shot fire from its ass. 682 wasn't a mindless beast either, but Scott could understand why Johnson liked to pretend otherwise. The kind of thoughts that ran through a mind like that were completely inimical to a human's. But they were thoughts nonetheless, and Dr. Scott had proof that Johnston would have seen immediately if he hadn't been so worried about a disemboweled D-class. The sensual violence of lust is all the assurance you will need to know the worth of life. That was a coherent sentence, one of maybe a dozen that 058 had uttered over the years. There might have been more, but Johnston and his new assistant, what was his name? Jason? Had those tapes. It frustrated Scott to no end that the key to cracking 058's language might have been languishing in that fool's desk drawer. But Johnston had seniority, both on the 058 project and in general, so the best Scott could do was hope Johnston was nearby the next time SCP-5229 decided to go for a swim. 058 had a nice voice, really, like something you'd hear in an audiobook. Maybe they should train it to read poetry. Then it might help him sleep instead of giving him nightmares. Maybe it'd put him to sleep anyway. I've crawled the trees with venom swings to the blind of the drooling path. Dr. Scott sat bolt upright in his chair. Maybe he'd imagined it. He had been on the edge of sleep, and he had been listening a little too long. Just to make sure he'd heard it right, he skipped back a few seconds and played it again. As he listened to another heart speak, his own was pounding. I've crawled the trees with venom swings to the blind of drooling path that flows electricity from eye to evening. There is no more than salvation in the bald mind of a husk that drinks his only kings. Dr. Scott pressed stop. Slowly, he opened his laptop and booted up the Foundation internal database. He remembered very well where he'd heard Drooling Path before, but in the Memetics Division, they train you not to trust your own memories unless they can be verified as genuine. Lucky for Conrad Scott, this particular memory could. He found what he was looking for in an addendum to SCP-1981's file, a transcript from Redacted 96. 12 minutes, 32 seconds. Reagan. I've been to the steel mills of Alaska and the cornfields of Nebraska. I've seen the derelict offices of Google Burn with the window boarded up and the squatters inside them. I've seen the houses where they cut up little babies. From coast to shining coast I have walked empty down Drooling Path, indecipherable. The decaying flesh of false morality poisoning our children. I have stood atop the mountain of this greedy earth, looking upon our beautiful pious pit, filled to bursting with the vast hands of helplessness. And did you know what I saw? The transcript didn't describe the heavy degraded video, but it didn't need to. Scott still remembered the way Ronald Reagan's head and neck had looked, sliced nearly to bits by whatever entity inhabited that ancient Betamax tape. He'd pored over that image and others like it, and all the transcripts that went with them, searching for any hint of a correlation or pattern that might reveal something, anything, about the alien consciousness driving the anomaly. How long had he combed through hours of video, hunting for clues to future events? How many times had he watched Ronald Reagan brutally mutilated, all for nothing? All those hours and days of research had never revealed a single clue to the anomaly's true nature. Eventually, he'd been reassigned to 058, and he'd given up on ever finding out the secrets of 1981. But now, more than a decade later, he finally had something. The same strange phrase, spat out by a completely different anomaly, years before a bleeding Ronald Reagan ever gargled it. Drooling path. Conrad smiled. They heard him from the cafeteria. When the security guards kicked open Dr. Scott's door, he was still dancing. "The drooling path," Dr. Scott exclaimed as he leapt in place, arms above his head like Rocky Balboa. "The drooling path." He turned to face the guard, smiling wide, eager to share this new breakthrough with anyone who'd listen. Then the guard tackled him. Even as he was cuffed and hauled away, Dr. Scott continued to cheer. "The drooling path," he shouted. "I knew it! I knew it!" Dr. Glass sighed. "Conrad needs a vacation." "He needs a reassignment," Dr. Johnston grumbled. "Well, that's what this interview is going to determine," Glass semi-agreed. He and Ames Johnston were walking side by side down a hallway in Armed Biocontainment Area 14, heading toward the cell where the overjoyed Dr. Scott had been detained. He wasn't trying to hurt anybody, but he'd been listening to 058 for almost an hour, and security wasn't taking any chances. "Dr. Johnston!" called an out-of-breath voice from behind. The doctor scowled and did not turn to face his assistant as the much younger scientist drew up beside him. "Yes, James?" "I was walking past Dr. Scott's office just now, and I—" "Great idea," Johnston interrupted, just wanting rid of the bothersome research assistant. "Go seize all of his 058 stuff and put it in my office." Now, Ames," Glass cautioned. "Don't you think you should wait until after the investigation to seize Conrad's possessions?" James, who was already turning to go, paused briefly. "Pfft," Johnston scoffed. "Scott's cracked. They won't fire him, no, but he violated containment procedures. He's off 058 for good." "You seem entirely too happy about your coworker's misfortune." Glass cast a sideways glance at Johnston, if only to frighten him. Johnston crossed his arms defensively. 058 is my project. Always has been. Scott's just here for that weird gibberish. "Word salad, sir," James corrected before he could stop himself. "Obsession he has. You know they kicked him off 1981 for trying to communicate with it." "Yes, I'm aware of Conrad's history. That's why they sent me instead of Yamada." There was a brief pause, during which Johnston's eyes glided over to James for the first time since he'd joined the conversation. "Is there a reason you're still here?" James startled, then shook his head. "No, sir, sorry, sir." Then he sprinted off down the hall, to loot Dr. Scott's office. You shouldn't treat him so poorly. Glass watched as James hurried off, drawing derogatory looks from passing staff. He needs it. The kid's soft. Lets everybody step on him. I'm just trying to toughen him up, so we won't crack like Scott just did. Now that the initial excitement had passed, Dr. Scott was frustrated. When he'd begun his celebratory dance, he hadn't considered the way it would look to anybody who barged in. So now he was stuck in a cell usually reserved for D-class, waiting for a psych eval. He was still pretty happy, though. He'd made the first real breakthrough on the speech patterns of both 058 and 1981 at the same time, nonetheless. Even better, he'd done it before that asshat Ames Johnston. He couldn't wait to get back to his office. That's why he hopped to his feet as soon as the door slid open, only for the smile to melt from his face. "Hello, Conrad." Dr. Glass smiled warmly as Scott collapsed back onto the narrow bed, face in his hands. "I'm not compromised," Dr. Scott exclaimed once again. "No one's saying that you are," repeated Glass, "but you certainly seem distressed." "I'm distressed because I'm in a cell instead of my office, where I need to be." "Doctor, you've worked plenty enough for today. I think you need a vacation." "Vacation?" Dr. Scott angrily rose to his feet once again. "I've just made the biggest breakthrough of my life." In his peripheral vision, he saw the security guard still standing at the cell door raise his weapon. Glass didn't seem to notice, but Scott took the hint and sat down. "And what exactly is this breakthrough?" Glass inquired. Scott couldn't resist himself. He'd been aching to tell somebody about it. Unlike Johnston and the meatheads guarding the door, Glass was intelligent. He would understand how important this was. Scott leaned forward and smiled. "The drooling path," he said. Glass's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry?" "The drooling path," Scott exclaimed. "I heard 058 say it." "So what?" Glass asked, writing something down. Scott had learned not to read upside down. It was a survival skill in the memetics division, but he didn't need to in order to know that this interview wasn't going well. With a little more urgency than before, he tried to explain himself. "I've heard it before." Glass looked up from his clipboard. 1981 said it. Glass returned to his writing. "Sounds like a coincidence to me." "Coincidence?" Scott shouted, surprising even himself. "There are more than 200,000 words in the English language. The chances of two unrelated anomalies coming up with the same phrase by pure coincidence are practically non-existent." "And you have another explanation, I assume?" "Yes." Scott leaned even closer to Glass, who looked up from his papers once again. "Because they aren't unrelated." "Stupid, stupid, stupid," James muttered, gathering up the CDs with 058's rantings on them. He hated it when Johnston treated him like shit, just because he was just a research assistant, not a proper researcher. James knew he should stand up for himself, but he also knew that talking back to Johnston would be a one-way ticket to Keter duty. James's friendlier colleagues had reassured him there was no such thing, but he wasn't so sure. He also hated rooting through Dr. Scott's office like this. It was an invasion of privacy, and he knew that he'd catch the blame when Dr. Scott wanted his 058 CDs back. Also, Dr. Scott's office was creepy. His desk was a disorganized mess of SCP files, beat poetry, and nonsensical notes to self. There was also a printed photograph of Ronald Reagan in the pile. It looked like someone had taken a photo of a TV playing a badly degraded VHS tape. The former president was barely recognizable. He almost looked like he was bleeding. The desk was nothing compared to the walls, though. There was a corkboard behind the desk completely covered in handwritten transcripts of 058 recordings, with words highlighted in different colors. Dr. Scott had even stuck pins in them and connected them with color-coded yarn like Fox Mulder. And right at the middle, written so big that it took up a whole page, was this: "The sensual violence of lust is all the assurance you will ever need to know the worth of life." Maybe Dr. Scott really was crazy. James quickly finished pulling the 20-some 058 discs in his duffel bag, then made for the door. He was almost out before he remembered to check the CD player itself. Reluctantly, James doubled back to Dr. Scott's chaotic desk and popped open the lid on a little compact CD player that lay there. There was indeed another disc inside it. James was about to remove it, but something made him stop. He'd been working with Dr. Johnston for 6 months now, but he still hadn't actually heard any of 058's ramblings. As far as James knew, Dr. Johnston never listened to it at all. He looked up at the open door, then back at the creepy corkboard. Then he closed the CD player and sat down. "Might as well," he said to himself. "Could be my only chance to actually hear the damn thing." It was only fair. He was assigned to 058 too, after all. Then he pressed play. "That's quite a theory. And I can prove it too. I just need to get back to my office." "No, Conrad, you need a break." "A break? But I'm so close. Why don't—" "I do, Conrad, I do. You really may be onto something. But the fact of the matter is, you've been listening to 058 far too often lately, and it's starting to affect your mental health." "Pfft, I'm fine." Instead of arguing, Dr. Glass produced his cell phone and showed Scott a photo of the corkboard behind his desk. Dr. Scott started to argue, then deflated. "Okay, maybe I have been working a little too hard." "That's okay, Conrad. Most people don't work hard enough. But you've done a good job today, and you deserve some rest." "I suppose." Glass knew damn well that Scott wouldn't be able to rest, not until he knew more about the drooling path. But he couldn't say that. Dr. Glass stood up. "I'm going to recommend that you be given the week off. Go to the beach, see a movie, stay at a hotel. Just get out of that godforsaken office, all right?" Scott sighed, resigned to his fate. "Well, a little fresh air couldn't hurt." "My point exactly. Is there anything you need from your office?" "Well, that isn't work-related." "Of course. Just my lunch." "Okay, I'll have someone go get those for you." Scott crossed his arms. "What, you don't trust me in my own office?" Glass didn't answer because he was already leaving. "Take him to the lobby, would you?" he whispered to the guard. "Don't let him out of your sight." The guard nodded, then turned to Scott while Glass headed off down the hallway. "Come on, let's go to the lobby. You are welcome in the world of frozen sundowns, but only while the childish members of tomorrow's mind die quietly in sudden sequence. James was horrified. No wonder Dr. Scott's office was such a madhouse if he listened to this on a regular basis. Never have the mass and water chosen to live in margins. No one has forgiven the lands of mixed and chosen men, ground to cinders by the life of derangement. Suddenly, James was seized with a sudden concern that these recordings might be mimetic or something. Dr. Scott had been detained by an armed guard. Maybe he'd gone nuts and tried to kill somebody. Hoping he hadn't been corrupted already, James reached forward to stop the CD player. I have Almost exactly when James stopped the playback, the door to the office swung even further open than it had been already, striking the wall with a startling noise. James jumped, finding himself face to face with Dr. Johnson. James! Yes, sir, he replied nervously. What's taking you so long? James began, but it turned out to have been a rhetorical question. Where are those discs? Johnston demanded. James repeated, grabbing up the duffel containing them. Here they are. Johnston thanklessly snatched it out of his hand. Excellent. Now go get me a coffee and come straight back to my office. With that, Dr. Johnston left the room as angrily as he'd entered it. Mean old bastard, he muttered. James started to leave again, but just like last time, he remembered the disc in the CD player when he was halfway out the door. Shit, he said, doubling back again to get it. Johnston would be seriously pissed, even though it was his own damn fault for being so impatient. Of course, it wasn't like the mean old bastard was actually going to listen to it. He was just taking the CDs out of spite. He probably wouldn't even notice if one of them went missing. James grinned. A little rebellion never hurt anybody. It's gonna tell him what to do. Vacation. All I never wanted. Dr. Scott didn't want to go on vacation. He needed to get back to work, but he didn't really have a choice. Not if the listening device he'd found behind the portrait of his late wife was anything to go by. The Foundation was keeping a close eye on him, for his own safety. Scott supposed that they expected him to rip his eyes and write beat poetry with the vitreous or something equally horrible, but still interesting, at least. But Conrad Scott was not an interesting man. On the rare occasions that he returned to his apartment at Area 14, located in the employee complex, a separate building from the main containment facilities and the offices, he did little more than read James Patterson books, and if he were particularly exhausted, sleep. He would have been perfectly content to let whoever was spying on him watch that same routine for the next week. But when Dr. Glass recommended something, you did it, if you knew what was good for you. That's why Conrad had spent the last half hour reading dozens of online articles full of vacation ideas, most of which he hated. Conrad didn't like the beach. Well, more accurately, he didn't like the ocean. Few Foundation employees did, once they learned about the staggering variety of distressingly large anomalies swimming around it. Vegas was too noisy and crowded. His artificial knees forbade him from skiing, and his bad back did the same for camping. He supposed he could visit a fancy lodge high up in the Rockies someplace, but he couldn't help but imagine himself typing the Drooling path over and over again on a typewriter in a huge empty room while ominous music played in the background. That's what he was typing right now, in fact, after the umpteenth unrewarding search for vacation ideas. He half-jokingly decided to punch in the Drooling path, just to see what came up. Unsurprisingly, most of the results were random pages about dogs or people drooling too much in their sleep. He barely noticed those results, though, because the first one actually contained the exact phrase, "My husband and I have walked drooling path to get here." Comrade blinked. He rubbed his eyes, read it again. The result in question was a review for a hotel in State College, Pennsylvania. Still not quite believing what he saw, he clicked on the link. It took him to a whole page of reviews, but he used the search function, Drooling Path, to find the one that brought him there. It wasn't very coherent, although he noted, with some disappointment, it was probably just because Kylie M. didn't speak English very well, not some anomalous source of word salad. "My husband and I have walked drooling path to get here. Bed in room 710 was soft and cozy and appreciated. The decor would recommend the bed and specifically the bed. Despite what he'd told Dr. Glass, Conrad was almost willing to believe that this particular incidence of the Drooling path really was a coincidence, just because it had turned up in such a ridiculous place. An online hotel review was a long way from a giant killer cow heart, or Ronald Reagan cut up while talking. At least, that's what he thought, until 3 words into the next sentence, he felt the mimetic hazard. Conrad slammed his eyes and laptop shut, gasping inarticulately. He hadn't been affected, of course. You didn't get to his position without a high mimetic resistance. This one felt like a weakling anyway. He probably could have read the whole thing without succumbing, but he didn't, because he'd already seen all he cared about. He knew where the Drooling path led next. "Dr. Johnston?" "Yes, James?" "I've been looking at 058's file, and I have a question about the containment procedures." "Really?" Johnston asked, peering at him briefly over his glasses. Yeah. It says here that we feed it a live cow every 3 days, but it doesn't say why." Johnston gave a rare smile, revealing the gap where his left front tooth had once been. "Ah, yes, I've gotten a lot of questions about that one." "You have?" "Of course," he answered, leaning back in his chair. "It was my idea." James now recognized the smugness in his boss's incomplete smile. "Really? Why do we do that?" "Why don't you tell me? Take a look at the 3rd paragraph of notes." James scrolled down on 058's file, open on his laptop. SCP-058 was finally contained after being crushed and incapacitated by a large amount of masonry from a building that had collapsed on top of it. SCP-058 was then extracted and transported to Redacted by agents and MTF teams. SCP-058 was contained at Redacted for 3 weeks, during which it made minimal attempts to move, attributed both to physical damage and bloating from Redacted. During the initial breach incident, testing during this period was limited, with SCP-058 still maintaining a high threat level even in its impaired state. "What about it?" James asked. "What do you think's behind the last black box?" I can't say." Dr. Johnson scoffed. "Sadly, neither can I. You don't have the clearance. But you can access the transcripts in the containment file, yes?" "Yes, sir." "Why don't you read them then? I think that'll answer your question." As his battered Taurus approached the gate, Conrad grew increasingly nervous. He'd have to show the guards his ID and possibly provide them with a plausible reason for leaving. That was a somewhat excessive security measure, but the questioning was really just a stalling tactic, so various well-hidden machines could scan him in his car for any giant parasitic spiders or tiny carnivorous sand that might be trying to hitch a ride out of containment. They probably wouldn't scan his voice for mimetic contamination, since Area 14 didn't have any memes or cognitohazards in containment. And they probably wouldn't find any even if they did, but the idea of it was still making him uneasy. If the Foundation found out that he'd identified a possible anomaly and gone after it himself instead of alerting a containment team, he'd definitely lose his job, probably his memory, and possibly his life. Now he had reached the gate, and a guard in full tactical gear was approaching his window. The word gate didn't really capture the essence of the edifice before him. While some sites had chain-link gates, or even just the little arms common to parking garages, this was an area. The so-called gate was really a motile wall, a yard-thick slab of reinforced steel that towered 30 feet into the air. It seemed a little excessive to some, but Conrad had seen the damage 058 could inflict. If anything, the gate wasn't enough. Of course, it wasn't intended to stop 058 at all, only to slow it down long enough for the nuclear fail-safe to go off. "ID?" the guard asked once Conrad's window was down. With a well-practiced motion, he unclipped the badge from his shirt and passed it to the security officer. The guard, whose nameplate read Torres, lifted his visor to squint at Dr. Scott's ID. Then he looked up to compare the tired young man on the badge with the exhausted old man in the car. "Conrad Scott?" he asked, as if anyone who wasn't already Conrad Scott would ever want to be. "The same," Conrad sighed. "Reason for leaving?" Conrad scowled, because he was certain that the personnel at the gate had already been informed of the reason for his sudden departure. "I'm taking a vacation." Conrad shifted uncomfortably, feeling a probably imaginary but still unpleasant tingling in his nether regions as his car was scanned. "To where?" Pennsylvania. Why? What authority question? He could make something up. Say he'd gotten his degree at Penn State, or that a non-existent grandkid lived there, but that information could be easily verified. He could simply refuse to answer, but that would arouse undue suspicion. Or he could dodge the question without actually refusing it. Because I've been ordered to take a vacation and I'm determined not to enjoy it. Torres's expression was unreadable. Only his eyes were visible, thanks to his raised visor. All right, Torres agreed, disinterested. Here you go. Had there been a moment of hesitation? Hopefully Conrad had imagined it. Thanks, Conrad said, returning the badge to his shirt. He rolled up his window to cut off any subsequent conversation, but it was unnecessary. To Conrad's relief, Torres was already returning to the fortified box where the gate controls were located. Once the door to the box was closed and locked, Conrad saw a different security officer behind the bulletproof glass turn a security key to activate the gate mechanism. There was another unit of guards in an identical fortified box on the other side. The key over there would also have to be turned before the steel wall would slide out of the way on its hidden rollers. After a tense pause, that's exactly what happened. An obnoxious alert siren blared as the massive gate rolled slowly to the left, revealing the snow-streaked slopes of Nevada's Ruby Mountains. The setting sun was sending shades of orange and purple sliding up the contours of the tree-studded rock. It was beautiful, but Area 14's location hadn't been chosen for the scenery. Surrounded by steep, wintry slopes and an hour's drive from the nearest town, the Foundation could detonate the nuclear failsafe without irradiating too many civilians. It was hard to enjoy the Purple Mountain majesties with that in mind. The siren finally stopped when the gate was fully open, retracted into a wall of reinforced concrete 5 times thicker than it. Conrad drove through the gate and breathed a sigh of relief as the siren blared again behind him. He watched the gate as it rumbled shut in his rearview mirror until the mountain road took a turn and blocked it from view. As you know, Dr. Johnston said, it had already killed dozens of personnel and probably hundreds of civilians before it was contained. James's question about the containment procedures had sparked a long recollection of 058's arrival. Though Johnston didn't like James very much, he loved the sound of his own voice. James wasn't about to stop him. After pilfering the CD and seeing Dr. Scott's office, he couldn't help but be curious about one of the most dangerous anomalies on site. It had already mostly almost escaped once, when they tried to move it to wherever it was originally supposed to go. Killed 10 more guys before somebody managed to park a tank on it. After that, the Foundation decided not to take any more risks and sent it here. They didn't tell us what it was. All we knew was that an extremely hostile Keter was inbound. We still knew enough to make peace with our life insurance policies before it got here, though. Once word got around about the containment chamber they were building, the walls in there were thicker than the ones we had around the complex at the time. Back then, you know, this was just biocontainment Area 14. Didn't need to be armed until 058 showed up. Before that, the most violent thing we had in here was Fernand. Why'd they bring it here then? Dr. Johnston shrugged. Probably just because they were closest. They didn't want to risk moving it too far in case something went wrong, which, of course, it did. The road leading down from Area 14 was not as narrow or winding as most mountain roads, as it had been designed to accommodate all manner of heavily armed and armored Foundation vehicles. 058 had been hauled up this road once, packed into an armored transport truck with tanks in front and behind to run over or blow up the anomaly if it escaped again. Conrad hadn't been stationed at Area 14 when that had occurred, but most of the other personnel had. When Conrad had first been assigned to 058 5 years ago, he'd been required to watch the footage of that day, so he would understand how dangerous the thing was. Unbeknownst to Conrad, the most junior member of the 058's assigned staff was currently reading the transcripts of that footage. Unlike Dr. Scott, James hadn't been required to watch the recordings of Incident 058-3. It was still the deadliest ABCA-14 breach to date, but the most recent Incident 939-3 had replaced it on the required viewing list for new personnel, to illustrate to them the potential dangers of not following containment procedures to the letter, or responding to emergency situations properly. James wasn't entirely sure what watching people get eaten by giant red lizards mimicking the voices of their victims would help anybody follow the rules better. But it did definitely scare the crap out of him. That's part of why he was dreading the 058 transcripts so much. But then again, no one at the SCP Foundation was ever stopped by a little dread. Security footage, Sector Epsilon, Hallway D, redacted. Begin log. A large forklift enters the frame, carrying a large metal box. SCP-058 is audible within. I know the mindful nothings that slink in muddy forests of final sin. 14 MTF New 7, Hammer Down, agents, armed with assorted heavy weaponry, enter the frame. Somewhere beyond the stolen moonrise clutches that which only the limbless mornings know with spoken freedom is no more. One side of the box containing SCP-058 suddenly dents outward. The forklift accelerates. The rodent child sifts restless through the midden nightfall, feeling the union of false men who speak only to rattle the shadows. The box containing SCP-058 rapidly dents in several more places. The upper face separates from the others at one corner, and a barbed tentacle emerges from the hole. The driver dives out of the forklift and attempts to flee. Only in the forgotten backwoods and battlefields. SCP-058's exposed tentacle lashes at the fleeing forklift driver, removing his left arm. SCP-058's vocalizations are inaudible over the driver's screams. The forklift continues to roll until it strikes the wall at the end of the hallway, about 50 feet from MTF New 7. Task Force agents assume combat formation and train their weapons on the forklift. Chilled in the holy snow of infant laudanum, now awakening to the dawn, the face of the box oriented towards MTF New 7 is struck by SCP-058, folding over and separating from the rest of the box. SCP-058, briefly visible, emerging from within. MTF New 7 fires on SCP-058. SCP-058 covers the distance between the ruptured containment cube and the MTF squad in less than 2 seconds. Blood sprays on the camera lens, obscuring the video feed. SCP-058's vocalizations are inaudible over the screams and gunfire of MTF New 7. Screams and gunfire cease. Tomorrow and the final year call only upon I and the ones who know no better option than to. SCP-058's vocalizations become inaudible as it moves away. Sprinklers activate, washing the blood from the camera. The fragmented, burned remains of New 7 agents are scattered throughout the hall. End log. James scrolled back to the top of 058's file. To date, SCP-058 has been responsible for the death of at least 149 Class D personnel and 14 agents at its current site. Well, there were the 14 agents. Expecting to find 149 dead D-Class, James opened the next file in the SCP-058 folder. He found an interview transcript instead. To his surprise, he recognized both of the names. Transcript of interview with D-067. Redacted. Begin log. Dr. Johnston. Good evening, D-067. D-067. No. Sorry, bad choice of words. I'm here too. I know why you're here. I don't want to talk about it. Well, you don't have a choice. I know that too. So, why don't we get started then? What do you want me to tell you? That I pissed myself and prayed to a god that, based on what happened last night, probably doesn't exist? Just tell me what happened. You know damn well what happened. It killed every single one of us, one at a time, because you sons of bitches left us pinned up in those cells to be slaughtered. We did what we had to do. If we hadn't let it kill the others, we wouldn't have been able to stop it. Oh, is that right? Now I feel so much better. You know what, Doc? Go F yourself. I hope that thing kills every single one of you, so you can get to sit there and listen to everyone you know get torn apart and burned alive when it recites that creepy-ass poetry. D-067, please. Do you want to know what it said to me, Doc? Or do you already know that too? No, The ill secrets of mourning cattle only seem asymmetrical from the outside. That's what it said, while I was hunkered down between the bed and the table and the wall, trying not to get my arms ripped off. Do you know what that means, Doc? I'm afraid not. Of course not, because it doesn't mean anything. There's no point. Just like the deaths of the other 149 disposables. Just like you trying to lock it in a box. Just like this. D-067 punches Dr. Johnston in the mouth, knocking him from his chair, before being subdued by security officers. End log. Eyes wide, James looked up at his boss, who was staring intently at the papers on his desk. As James watched, Dr. Johnston absent-mindedly probed the gap in his teeth with the tip of his tongue. James supposed he now knew where that tooth had gone. Worse, he also knew what had happened to D067 from 058's file. James took another cautious glance at his gap-toothed superior. He knew the Ds were disposable. That was the first thing they taught you when you came to work at the Foundation. You have to be able to do what needs to be done, even if it involves loss of human life. 149 convicted death row inmates aren't worth over-redacted citizens by any estimation, to say nothing of the redacted faculty and redacted agents who died at Site Redacted, or the 14 agents who'd been killed downstairs. Were their grisly deaths horrible beyond belief? Absolutely. But not as horrible beyond belief as that same stuff happening to unsuspecting civilians. We die in the dark to protect those in the light. That's what they said. But sending D067 into 058's chamber, knowing he'd be torn apart, that was different. That wasn't an ethical choice in the name of the utilitarian greater good. James couldn't imagine any good reason to have sent D067 into 058's room. He'd always known Dr. Johnston was mean, of course, but that was cruel. It certainly made all those Keter duty jokes a lot less funny. While he pondered that uncomfortable thought, James went ahead and opened the third and final file. Security footage, Sector Epsilon Hallway F, redacted. Begin log. The camera shows the blast doors that separate sectors Delta and Epsilon, approximately 50 feet away at the end of a wide corridor. New 7 Commander, redacted, located somewhere behind the camera. Get ready. The blast doors open, revealing the D-Class cafeteria in Sector Delta. The cafeteria is splattered with blood, and sprinklers are running. A 10-second clip of Led Zeppelin's Heartbreaker plays from a loudspeaker somewhere behind the camera. Unidentified New 7 agent. That should get its attention. SCP-058. Indistinct. New 7 Commander redacted. Fire at my command. SCP-058 moves into view on the other side of the open blast doors. It is bloated to twice its original size, dragging itself slowly across the ground with its legs and tentacles. Falling into the eye of distortion, I felt only wilderness hissing. SCP-058 crawls into the corridor. Commander redacted remotely detonates the numerous M18 Claymore anti-personnel mines affixed to the walls and ceiling of the corridor. Fire! MTF New 7 fires upon SCP-058 with machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and data expunged. SCP-058's vocalizations are inaudible above the gunfire and explosions, and it is briefly obscured from view by smoke and steam. Hold your fire. MTF Nu 7 stops firing. The smoke clears. SCP-058 lies heavily damaged and unmoving at the center of a spreading pool of blood. Several of its limbs are partially or completely missing, and large chunks of cardiac tissue have been blasted or torn apart. Human limbs protrude from the holes. Lachrymose swine sinks stolidly into the mindful pit of destruction and non-committal attribution of all that was never brought to pineal justice in abattoir abstraction. Jeez. Go! Numerous Nu 7 agents rush forward, flanking a large, heavily armored forklift. I rise and fall to winter, twisting to see the drought of bounty that plucks the hands from slumbering astronauts. The forklift picks up SCP-058, shifts into reverse, and begins driving towards SCP-058's new containment chamber. The agents follow it at a safe distance, keeping their weapons trained on SCP-058. Spoken words and fizzling silences serve only to increase the breadth of white illusion. When the iron thaws and only diagenesis persists through the apostasis hurricane, then comes the mild balm of a million backfires. End log. Nervously, James looked at the floor. Somewhere below, SCP-058 was raging against the sides of its cell, trying to tear its way out and finish the rampage it began in 19 Redacted. Or maybe it simply lay there, bloated on blood and viscera. But no matter what else it was doing, it would be talking, making a whole new batch of ominous word salad, just like the one on the CD in James's jacket pocket. In retrospect, maybe swiping it hadn't been such a good idea. As Conrad Scott descended the mountain road, he fumbled one of his stoner metal albums into the CD player. As the first strains of Dragonaut filled his car, Conrad frowned. Fiddling with the music CD had reminded him of the ones with 058's recordings on it, which he had a sneaking suspicion wouldn't be there when he got back from State College. The drive was long. It gave Conrad plenty of time to plan the specifics of his impromptu vacation. He wouldn't be able to make it from Nevada to Pennsylvania by car, not without a blood clot anyway. But he could probably catch a flight direct from Vegas to Pittsburgh. Once there, he intended to rent a car and drive the rest of the way. He liked that plan, because it meant that any tracking devices in his personal car wouldn't be following him to the Atherton Hotel, where he hoped to find... What did he hope to find? Conrad ran a quick meme check, just to make sure his mind was really his own. Normally, he'd have said it out loud for extra clarity, but he opted to just mouth it in case there were any listening devices around. I am Dr. Conrad Scott, Ph.D. I am currently driving to Las Vegas so I can fly from there to Pittsburgh and then drive a rental car to the Atherton Hotel in State College. I want to do this because I saw the phrase "the drooling path" in a review for that hotel, a review that contained a cognitohazard, and I previously heard that phrase when dealing with SCPs 058 and 1981. I did not notify a containment team because I want to be the one who finally solves this mystery, because I've spent years of my life on both of these SCPs and I'm not about to let someone else get the credit. I am making this decision of my own free will out of a desire to redeem the years of my life that I've wasted on my last 2 projects, not a subconscious suicidal urge or whatever else that cognitohazard was supposed to implant in my brain. He drove on, listening to sleep. "Yeah," he whispered, "and I don't recognize the bodies in the water either." Then he laughed, because the people in the memetics division have a weird sense of humor. Vacation. I can't get away. Working on a mystery. When James returned to his apartment that evening, the CD in his pocket seemed to weigh 10 pounds. His roommates were playing Magic the Gathering and being ridiculous as usual. "I'm just saying, I think 058 could take it," Mark said. "No way," Carl pondered, examining the cards in his hands. 682's too big. "Yeah, but 058's faster." "So? It's too small." "What are you talking about? Things like the size of a minivan." "What? It's a cow heart. They're like this big." He demonstrated with his hands, unwittingly exposing his cards to his opponent. "Yeah, but cow hearts don't have tentacles and shit either." Mark noticed James furtively extracting a bag of chips from the refrigerator. "Hey, you work on 058? "Yeah?" James said, frozen awkwardly in front of the half-open fridge. "How big is it? On a scale of normal cow heart to minivan." Minivan, definitely." "Ha! Told you." "Well, so what?" Carl protested. "So it's got size and speed. 682 can regenerate as much as it wants. 058's got it beat. Tell him, James." James, who was already halfway to his room, just shrugged and avoided eye contact. "Hey, you all right?" Mark called after him. James didn't answer, just closed his bedroom door. He appreciated Mark's concern, but those two were insufferable sometimes. If they were working on SCP-058, they wouldn't discuss it so casually. Once he had his laptop out, James put on his headphones so he wouldn't have to hear another debate about whether or not 058 was capable of seeing SCP-096's face. He'd been wrestling internally all day, unsure if he should really listen to the CD he'd stolen or just put it back without Johnston noticing. On the one hand, he enjoyed the simple act of rebellion and was genuinely curious about its disturbing content. Morbidly curious, perhaps, but curious nonetheless. 058's vocalizations were just coherent enough to make you think that there was some kind of hidden meaning that you'd missed. It was like a riddle, kind of. But on the other hand, it was actually pretty scary. Hearing that old man's voice go on and on, perfectly calm, without even pausing for breath, was subtly unnerving in ways James couldn't really describe. Then on top of that, there was this fear that whatever had happened to Dr. Scott might also happen to him. He sat there at his desk, laptop open and CD in his hands. Was he really going to chicken out and not even listen to this thing he'd stolen? Admittedly, whether or not he listened didn't change the fact that he was sticking it to Dr. Johnston, And that had been the whole point of this, really, hadn't it? Sure, the actual content of the disc was interesting, but it wasn't like he had to hurry. His interest in 058's recordings was purely personal. There was no paper to be written, no report to be filed. He could do it whenever he wanted. At the very least, he could wait until there was a clear victor in the battle between his morbid curiosity and the vague sense of dread oozing from the CD. Besides, it was probably better anyway to wait a few more days to see if something bad really had happened to Dr. Scott before following in his footsteps. Having come to this lack of a decision, he stashed the CD in his desk drawer to be thought about some other time. Conrad made excellent time. It wasn't even dark yet when he first spotted the lights of Sin City on the horizon. Though Area 14 was as isolated as possible, that also meant that the roads had been essentially deserted. Once he'd gotten out of the mountains, he'd popped Welcome to Sky Valley into the CD player and exceeded the speed limit by as much as his car could manage. It looked as though he'd reach Vegas in time for a late dinner, after which he could check into the hotel room he'd already reserved for the night. There was a plane flying direct to Pittsburgh the following morning, and he'd already reserved a seat. If everything went according to plan, he'd be at the Atherton by this time tomorrow. Las Vegas was a popular vacation destination for the personnel of ABCA 14. On the rare occasion that someone was allowed to leave, it was simply the most convenient place to blow off steam. And if you worked at the ABCA, you had a lot of steam to blow off. That said, Conrad himself had only been there once, shortly after being transferred to that godforsaken base in the mountains. Some younger colleagues, Jose and Bart had been their names, had talked him into coming along for a weekend of debauchery over the holidays. They'd enjoyed themselves, but he'd found the jangling slot machines and overcrowded casinos to be an assault on the senses, as well as the wallet. Sometimes he wondered if there was a correlation, because unlike Jose and Bart, he was still alive. Bart got his neck broken for coming at SCP-326 with a needle. Jose, on the other hand, caught some of SCP-1801's nastier components in a screw-up at the medical facility. Bart was the luckier one. But none of that mattered right now. This wasn't a vacation, regardless of what Dr. Glass said. It was a mission. Conrad stopped at the first decent restaurant he saw for dinner, and had already forgotten its name by the time he arrived, leftovers in hand, at his hotel. He made his way up to his room with as little human contact as possible, then settled in for what was unlikely to be a restful sleep. He would at least make an attempt to get some sleep, though since his flight was an early one. It was perfectly normal, on the edge of sleep, for a person's mind to wander back over the events of the day, the things that had been bothering them at work and such. Conrad was no different, but the events of the day and the things that had been bothering him at work were the things normal people had nightmares about. Conrad was lucky enough tonight to be worn out from the combined effects of his morning outburst and the monotonous drive through the desert, so he didn't have much trouble falling asleep for once. Of course, once he finally was asleep, no amount of exhaustion could protect him. Conrad was with his wife, They were dining at their favorite establishment, a restaurant and microbrewery back in her rural hometown. It wasn't a fancy eatery, but the food was good. The speakers were quietly playing some soft rock, Steely Dan perhaps. "Outsourcing the upside of our swim lane," she said in SCP-058's voice. "Oh no," Conrad sighed, closing his eyes. Lucid dreaming was reflexive for anyone who'd come out of memetics division training with their brains still between their ears, but Conrad had always had difficulty waking himself up. "Downsizing our synergistic paradigm," Allison continued. "Just a second," he said, staring intently at her. If he couldn't wake up, maybe at least he could turn Allison's voice back to normal. He concentrated, trying to remember how she'd sounded the last time he'd spoken to her. "Give me innovative pain points," she replied. Her voice still wasn't quite right, and she was still spitting that god-awful corporate buzzword salad, but at least she didn't sound like 058. She smiled at him, but he couldn't bring himself to do the same. Lucidity was a double-edged sword. Though he knew the nightmares weren't real, he couldn't fool himself into thinking the good parts were either. A waiter approached. He had the face of Ronald Reagan. "What did I see atop the Scarlet Mountain travesties?" he asked, and his right ear was peeled away. Conrad glared at the waiter, daring him to be mutilated any further. "We're still deciding," he said. "Now there you go again," the waiter sighed. He wandered off, leaving a trail of blood and a piece of nose on the floor nearby. "Stick to our core at a lovely little hotel," Allison began. "Shh," he replied, holding out a hand to stop her. "Just let me look at you." Unlike her voice, he had no trouble remembering her face. He saw it every day in the picture on his desk, the last one taken of her before the whole reality fell apart and exposed the weird world that had been there all along. It was nice to see her again, even if it was only her facsimile in a dream. As the restaurant dissolved into the static of a degraded Betamax tape, he focused on her face, her long black hair, her nose, which she was self-conscious about, but he thought was her best feature, and finally her deep blue eyes, the last thing that remained of the dream as it faded away. Conrad woke up with a headache half an hour before his alarm. It was not going to be a good day, but his foul mood was mitigated somewhat by the hope that he might catch some Z's on the plane. This thought, along with the mounting anticipation of whatever waited for him in Pennsylvania, was what motivated him through his morning routine. The checkout process, the trip to the airport, and all the various annoyances that inevitably awaited him there. The flight boarded on schedule, and he was happy to settle into a second-class back-row window seat for a nap. Unfortunately, sleep eluded him. It turned out that he mingled excitement and trepidation regarding the Atherton Hotel was too intense for him to relax. Conrad briefly allowed himself to fantasize about the outcome of this trip. Perhaps he'd finally solve the mystery of SCP-1981's true purpose and nature, or determine where 058 had come from, or both. Maybe, if he was really lucky, he'd discover some reliable way of understanding or communicating with one or both anomalies. any of these outcomes would be the first major breakthrough on the corresponding object in decades, and his first major discovery about any object. Perhaps the information he gained would be so useful that the Foundation would hold back on demoting or terminating him after they found out about this insane off-the-books investigation. Conrad frowned. He hadn't yet given much consideration to how he'd explain himself when this was over. Usually when someone tracked down an anomaly on their own time, they just claimed they'd randomly stumbled across it on vacation. Conrad doubted that excuse would work for him, however. As soon as the Foundation found out about the hotel, they'd search for it online, and it wouldn't take long after that to make the Drooling path connection. Though what he was doing wasn't technically forbidden, it was still completely against procedure and incredibly stupid besides. It then occurred to him that he was, perhaps falsely, assuming he'd survive whatever happened at the hotel. Conrad had been too busy booking flights, planning drives, and scheduling car rentals to seriously ponder what he actually expected to encounter in State College. This whole trip was precipitated on the assumption that the anomaly at the hotel was somehow connected to SCPs 058 and 1981. But beyond that, he knew very little. The near gibberish in which the cognitohazardous review was written suggested that Kaylee M., if she even existed, probably wasn't human. A human leaving hazardous online reviews, perhaps to draw more customers to their hotel chain, would have done a much better job making them look normal. However, the fact that it wasn't completely nonsensical was in some ways more worrisome. 058's vocalizations were complete gibberish because, Conrad believed, it wasn't trying to communicate. It had never shown any interest in anything but destruction, so the things it said were probably just intended to distract or frighten humans, so they'd be easier to kill. The hotel review, on the other hand, was a deliberate attempt to imitate human communication by something that clearly didn't understand it very well. The thought of a being as completely divorced from sane reality as 058 trying to pass itself off as human made Conrad's skin crawl. He didn't know why such an entity would advertise for some random hotel in Pennsylvania, but doubted that it wanted him to have a nice stay. Perhaps it was just vague memories of Stephen King's 1408, but Conrad was seriously concerned the hotel might try to eat him. Then there was the question of SCP-1981. What could a killer heart monster and an alien hotel room possibly have in common with a future-predicting video of a mutilated president? Not much, he suspected. SCP-1981 had also predicted 9/11 and various other events that certainly weren't connected to SCP-058, so it was entirely possible that the cut-up Ronald Reagan's mention of the Drooling path was just another one of those predictions. The prospect that such a phrase might one day become relevant to American politics was certainly frightening, but like most of 1981's messages, it didn't really amount to much meaningful or actionable information. If Conrad wanted to know more about this Drooling path business, he'd have to find something at the hotel. This train of thought led Conrad back to something that had been bothering him since he first embarked on this mad crusade. He'd never finished reading the review. He was too afraid that there might be stronger hazard further on, one that he wouldn't be able to resist as easily as the first. If a second hazard snagged him, He might march right into the jaws of the alien hotel room, or whatever it was, without even leaving a helpful note for the people who would eventually come looking for him. It was also possible that the review wouldn't prove more hazardous than he could handle, and the information contained within might be the one thing that helped him survive whatever was waiting in room 710. After some consideration, though, he decided that this latter possibility was unlikely. The review was a lure, created by an entity that was at least smart enough to attempt limited human speech. He doubted that such an entity would have provided any helpful information to its potential customers, prey, or whatever else it intended the people snared by its trap to be. He was much more likely to gain an advantage by showing up unaffected by the cognitohazard, hopefully to the hotel entity's surprise. Either way, he should probably buy a gun before he checked in. "Huh?" Martha asked, wheeling her cart to a stop. She looked at the door across the hall, the one to room 106. Then she looked back at the one in front of her, room 710. She stared at the number for a few more moments, a puzzled expression on her face, before shaking her head and getting back to work. The weird numbering must have just been a typo or something. It was probably supposed to be room 107. Whatever its number was supposed to be, it needed cleaning. When she opened the door, she heard faint music coming from within. It wasn't unheard of for guests to leave the TV on, but it was annoying. Just one more mess for her to clean up. As if the shit stains in the toilet, wet towels on the floor, used condoms under the bed, and full trash can beside the desk weren't enough. That was a worst-case scenario, of course, but people who did one inconsiderate thing tended to do more than one. As she stepped inside, Martha was disappointed to find that room 710 was no exception. The people who'd stayed there last night had evidently left in quite a hurry. The covers for one bed had been slung haphazardly on the floor. All the lights had been left on, and some knucklehead had forgotten his toothbrush. She decided to deal with the TV first. However, as she crossed to the center of the room, Martha didn't see the remote anywhere. It was probably bundled up in the covers, slung off to the side in the difficult-to-reach gap between the bed and the wall. Sighing, she turned around to switch it off the old-fashioned way. The TV was on some kind of music channel, playing what sounded like elevator music. She couldn't discern any more information about it, because instead of displaying the song title or artist like a normal music channel, this one just had a picture of a sailboat on a lake, taking up the whole screen. The music wasn't half bad, though, so she decided to let it play, at least until she found the remote. Maybe it had helped to ease her annoyance at the disrespectful tenant of this room while she cleaned up his leavings. The remote was not bundled up in the bedclothes, nor was it under the bed. As Martha eventually discovered, the previous tenant had somehow managed to knock it behind the nightstand. Then he'd been too lazy to reach behind there and fish it out. Now she'd have to do it. Martha swore quietly but profusely as she crouched down in the narrow space between the bed and nightstand, feeling behind it for the remote. She had just managed to get a grip on it when she heard the voice. It wasn't familiar to her, but Dr. Conrad Scott would have recognized it in the beat of a giant bovine heart. "Let me tell you a story." "What?" asked George, manager of the Atherton Hotel. "She quit," Jess repeated. "Why?" Jess, the woman who'd been at the desk when Martha left, shrugged. "Not sure. Something about room 710, I think." George's brows furrowed. 710? What did she say? "I don't know. Something about the TV. She didn't stick around." Jess bit her lip for a second, debating, before she continued. "She looked scared." George put a hand to his forehead. "Great. Wonderful. I step out for 30 minutes and my employees start going nuts." With a sigh, he looked up at Jess. "Well, thanks for letting me know." "No problem, boss." She started to leave, but stopped at the door. George?" "Yes?" "What is the deal with 710? "The number's a typo. It was supposed to be—" "No, not that." "What then?" I don't know exactly. It just seems like the people who stay there are always in a hurry to leave. Nobody ever stays more than one night." George said, rubbing his forehead again. "I don't know. Maybe the beds are uncomfortable." "Then why is it always booked? I work the desk a lot, and that room's never vacant. Yesterday, some guy called and requested it specifically." "I don't know," George said, somewhat irritably. "I guess people are just leaving really good reviews or something." "But don't you have a desk to be working?" he snapped, surprising Jess and himself. "Sorry." Jess scowled, then returned to her post. George leaned forward, placing both elbows on his desk and both hands on his face. He wished people would stop asking about room 710. He didn't know what was wrong with it, and he didn't care, as long as it kept bringing in more money than the rest of the hotel combined. So what if the numbers didn't make any sense? Who cared if it was the only room that broke the otherwise symmetrical layout of the floor plan? And what difference did it make if, when he'd first been promoted to manager, he could have sworn it didn't exist? Going wherever it leads. Hotel, motel. As usual, James was awakened by an explosion. He didn't understand why MTF New 7 always had to do these drills or tests or whatever it was they were doing at such an ungodly hour. People kept telling him he'd get used to the rattling of his apartment walls, but he doubted he'd ever be able to sleep through it. Grumbling under his breath, James stumbled into the kitchen for breakfast. The explosions had abated some by the time he finished his bagel, but James was too awake by then to get back to sleep. He hated having his Saturday morning ruined like that, but hopefully he'd have time for a nap later. At least he'd managed to avoid his roommates. He took a warm shower to shake off the lingering grogginess of disrupted sleep, then settled in for a relaxing day of binge-watching. While he was loading a Doctor Who DVD into his PlayStation, James remembered the stolen CD in his desk. His eyes glided over to the desk for a moment, but he shook his head and pushed thoughts of SCP-058 aside. Today was his day off. Despite that, James found it increasingly difficult to focus on the extraterrestrial misadventures of Britain's favorite time traveler. Now that he wasn't quite as worried about the CD, the other events of yesterday were starting to weigh heavier on his mind. In particular, he was concerned about Dr. Scott. It wasn't uncommon for a researcher to crack under the stress of life at Area 14, but it was usually someone relatively new like James himself, not an experienced scientist like Dr. Scott. Of course, if the appearance of his office was any indication, Dr. Scott had been on the edge of sanity for a long time. Dr. Johnston had always been of the opinion that Scott was nuts, but James had just chalked it up to the bitter rivalry between the two scientists. He was too afraid to ask why they hated each other so much, but figured it was probably an outgrowth of their general dislike for the assignment. Area 14, he'd been told, was often a punishment detail. The place where people who'd screwed up badly enough to get reassigned were sent, instead of being fired. Dr. Johnston, he knew, had been reassigned from Area 12 after a failed 682 termination, something to do with cherry petals. James didn't know much about Dr. Scott's past, but he doubted that anyone would work on SCP-058, or anything else at Area 14 for that matter, voluntarily. James just hoped he'd be able to transfer somewhere nicer, like Site-17, once he was a proper researcher and not just an assistant. They had safe-class anomalies over there. No man-eating ogres, no voice-mimicking lizards, no giant parasitic spiders, and certainly nothing like 058. Just a bunch of low-risk humanoids. They didn't even have a nuclear fail-safe. And best of all, Site-17 wouldn't have a mobile task force drilling in the parking lot at the crack of dawn. Over there, he'd be able to sleep. Conrad had seen pictures of the Atherton while making his reservation, but in the long hours since then, his imagination had distorted it into a vast, ominous mansion like the Shining's Overlook Hotel. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or disappointed when it turned out to be just as normal and boring as every other hotel he'd stayed at. He stood awkwardly in the lobby for a while, dully surveying its predictable modern furnishings with dry, puffy eyes. He was sure that, if not for the powerful aching of his joints and the ear-splitting drone of Electric Wizard, he'd have fallen asleep during the 4-hour drive to State College and died in an embarrassingly non-anomalous fashion, surrounded by Steak and Shake bags. He'd had a garlic steak burger for lunch on his way out of Pittsburgh, and again for dinner shortly after arriving in State College. It wasn't good for his health, or his breath, but neither was anything else about this trip. Well, except maybe the pistol he'd purchased less than 30 minutes ago. The man at the counter had looked at him funny, probably suspecting from Conrad's demeanor that he was planning to do something stupid and dangerous, but he hadn't cared enough to ask questions. The background check worried Conrad, not because he had a criminal record, but because he feared some Foundation web crawler would notice the purchase and send a task force after him. There wasn't much he could do about that, though. Conrad only realized he'd been standing there for too long when the woman at the desk called out to him. "Welcome to the Atherton Hotel," Jess said. "How can I help you?" Conrad's head creaked around to her, a young black woman holding a wide but somewhat confused smile as she surveyed the strange old man who'd wandered into her lobby. Now he wandered up to her desk. "Checking in," Conrad croaked, his voice heavy with jet lag and sleep deprivation. "Name?" "Scott." Just pulled up his reservation on the computer, then frowned. "What?" Conrad asked. "You're the guy who asked for 710. "Yes. Is there a problem?" Conrad mused at how cruelly ironic it would be if the hotel had made some bureaucratic flub and given the room to someone else. Jess looked cautiously behind her. The door to George's office was closed, and she could faintly hear him talking. He must have been on the phone. "What is it?" Conrad asked again, more irritably this time. He was surprised when Jess leaned over the counter towards him. "Why do you want the room?" she asked quietly. "Why does it matter?" he asked, looking confused. "There's something weird about it." "Weird how?" "I don't know. People always want to stay there, but they always leave after one night, and this morning." She looked back at George's office again, then leaned in even closer and lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "One of the maids saw something in there that scared her so bad she quit." "What did she see?" Conrad whispered, eyes wide. She shook her head. "Not sure. Something on the TV." Conrad said. He briefly wondered if it had been anything to do with Ronald Reagan. Jess looked at him suspiciously. "You already knew that room was weird, didn't you?" "No," he lied unconvincingly. Leaning back, Jess crossed her arms. "Then why do you want that one specifically?" He stuttered. Conrad hadn't expected an interrogation. "I read a really persuasive review." That wasn't technically a lie, but Jess still didn't buy it. "FBI?" she asked. He obviously couldn't admit to the existence of the Foundation, but he could certainly throw the UIU under the bus. "Something like that, yeah." Jess did buy that one, perhaps because she'd watched too much of the X-Files. "Well, it's about time," she said. "There's something very wrong up there." "Well," he said, straightening up slightly for dramatic effect, "I intend to get to the bottom of it. Thanks for the heads up." "Don't mention it. Here's your key." "Thanks." He took the card and started off towards his room, but Jess suddenly called out after him. "Hey, She looked back at the computer screen for a second. "Conrad?" "Yeah?" "Be careful," she warned. He just nodded in reply, then continued off down the hall. Jess watched him go. She was glad that someone in the know had finally come to investigate the place, but there was something in his bloodshot, baggy eyes that she didn't like. James didn't make many trips outside his room during the day, usually only to grab a snack or visit the suite's shared and therefore disgusting bathroom. He made a trip to the site cafeteria for dinner, where he kept his head down and ate as fast as possible to make sure no one would try to talk to him. Not that he really expected anyone to try. By the evening, James had grown tired of Doctor Who and spent almost an hour flipping idly through his various books and digital media before collapsing, defeated and bored, on his bed. There was nothing to watch, nothing to play, nothing to read, not even anything to listen to. Wait. James's eyes glided back over to his desk drawer, where the 058 CD had lain forgotten all day. Was he really so bored that he'd risk exposure to a mimetic hazard? Surely a few more episodes of stale British sci-fi would be preferable to that. Less interesting, of course, but far safer. Then again, James reassured himself, the containment procedures said that as long as he didn't listen for more than 30 minutes, he'd be fine. Well, that's not exactly what they said, but He felt sure that any dangerous mimetic properties of 058's poetry would have been mentioned somewhere in the file. That's why, with some trepidation, he placed the CD in his computer's disk drive and got ready for a disturbing evening. At first, James just sat there with his eyes closed, drinking in the surreal stream of consciousness imagery. But that soon proved too disturbing to tolerate. To help mitigate the chills running up and down his spine, James opened Fate and dedicated approximately half his attention to exploring its infinite, randomly generated dungeon. Only later would it occur to him that this had been a mistake, as Fate took up the whole screen, obscuring the clock that otherwise might have warned him he'd gone past the 30-minute mark. His avatar was locked in mortal combat with a group of venomous wyverns when something in 058's gibbering caught his attention. He wasn't consciously aware of what it was since he'd been distracted by the game, so he paused Fate and rewound the CD a few seconds. Unexpected finality comes not as a colourful vehicle, but in a grey that knows not to stay before. I have crawled the trees with venom's wings to blind of the drooling path that flows electricity from eye to the evening. There is no more than salvation in the bold mind of a husk that drinks his only kings. James couldn't quite place what made this particular nonsense stand out from the rest of it. He played it a second time, then realized it had sounded familiar because this was the same part that had played when he'd listened to it in the office. Then James noticed the time. "Oh shit," he said, reaching for the eject button. He froze halfway there, though, because he'd suddenly remembered something else. When Dr. Scott freaked out, James had been on his way back to Dr. Johnston's office from the restroom. The trip hadn't brought him especially close to Dr. Scott's office, but the elderly researcher had made quite a bit of noise during his episode. He'd been shouting one phrase in particular, one that James hadn't attached any significance to until now. The drooling path. James plucked out his headphones and leaned back in his chair. The faint sound of Mark and Carl good-naturedly arguing about something drifted in through his door, but he paid them no heed. What about the drooling path had made Dr. Scott flip out like that? Momentarily forgetting his concerns about mimetic contamination, James opened Firefox and Googled it. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting, but it definitely hadn't been a hotel review. He clicked on the link, curious as to how a mildly disturbing phrase like drooling path would end up in such a mundane place. He Control-F'd his way down to the review in question and was initially disturbed to find it nearly as nonsensical as what he'd been listening to. As he read it, though, it started to make more sense. Kaylee M. had just recommended the bed so many times because it was really comfortable. He sighed, thinking about how nice it'd be, nice to relax into a meandering menace beside some crisp blue hydrogen. And James couldn't remember the last time he'd seen a toucan man. Maybe he should just call in sick tomorrow and go stay at a hotel. James's suitcase was half full before it occurred to him what he was doing didn't make any sense. First of all, he hated hotels. The very idea of sleeping in a bed that had been slept in and screwed in by hundreds of thousands of strangers made his skin crawl. Second, he couldn't just call in sick. Research assistants were allowed to leave Area 14 on the weekends, but they still faced serious punishment if they weren't back by curfew. And third, What the hell was a toucan man? James? Mark asked. James was surprised to find himself back in the living room, dragging his suitcase behind him. Huh? He asked, disoriented. Mark and Carl were playing MTG on the coffee table again, but they'd both stopped the game to look at him. Specifically, they were looking at him like he was a crazy person, which James thought he might be. Where are you going? Mark asked. You don't look so good, Carl added. Where was he going? State College, Pennsylvania? Why on earth would he do that? Dude, Mark stood up. I think you might want to sit down for a second. No, James said hesitantly. I don't want to sit down. I want to go to bed, and specifically the bed, and specifically the bed. What? What was he saying? Mark was now approaching him. Here, he said, guiding James toward one of the chairs in the dining room. James didn't let go of the suitcase until he sat down. Let me get you some water. James sat there in the chair, dazed, while Mark got him a glass of crisp blue hydrogen from the sink. Hey man, Carl spoke, still sitting in the living area. You're drooling. Drooling? James asked, raising a hand to his lips to wipe away the thick strand of saliva that dangled from his chin. Here, Mark said, handing James the water. James looked at it, and something about the nice, clear water in the nice, clear glass finally dragged him back to his senses. Mark, he asked, taking the glass with one trembling hand. Yeah, dude? I don't feel so good. Yeah, you don't look good either. What happened? He began, but stopped himself. James didn't have any first-hand experience with cognitohazards, but he learned about them as part of his training. He was pretty sure Mark had just saved him from one. I don't know. What's the suitcase for? Mark asked, taking a seat next to his roommate. Were you gonna leave? Instead of answering, James took a big sip of water. I think the pressure's got to him, Carl opined. I heard Dr. Scott blew up yesterday, too. That wasn't the case. At least, James didn't think it was, but he was grateful to Carl for the excuse. Yeah? Mark asked, surprised. That's what I heard. Carl repeated. Yeah, James gasped, swallowing a mouthful of water. He was listening to 058 tapes, started screaming. Shit, Mark remarked. What'd they do to him? Mandatory vacation, I think. James shook his head back and forth a little to clear it. What's going on with you? I don't know. I guess I just... See, I'm on 058 too, and I read some of the transcripts today. I guess it just got to me a little bit. Mark nodded. Well, no wonder. That thing's freaking scary. You have no idea. Mark placed a hand on James's shoulder. He meant it as a consoling gesture of camaraderie, but it only made James more uncomfortable. It's all right, dude. This is a tough job. Hell, I puked when they showed me the 939 tapes. Yeah, me too, Carl added. That was messed up. James nodded and took another sip of water. Thanks, Mark. Hey, don't mention it. Mark patted him on the shoulder once, and then let go and leaned back. Feeling better? Yeah, just got kind of a headache. One that was getting steadily worse. All right, you want to join us? He asked, pointing at Carl, who brandished his handful of cards. Nah, James grunted. I think I'm just gonna go to bed. Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Get some sleep. Mark stood up, patted James's shoulder again, and went back over to Carl. The two of them watched as James carefully got to his feet and dragged himself and his suitcase back into his room. Once the door was closed, he sat heavily on the bed. Had he really been hit with a cognitohazard? He didn't dare look at the review again to make sure. Mark's thick-headedness had saved James this time, but if he had another fit like that, they'd call a containment team for sure. Then again, maybe that'd be for the best. If James had really been compromised by the review, he could be dangerous. But he didn't want to get put on mandatory vacation like Dr. Scott. James's eyes suddenly widened. What if Dr. Scott's breakdown had been caused by the same hotel review? What if, after hearing 058 say the drooling path, he'd Googled it and found the same thing that James did, and now he was on vacation? He could be on his way to that hotel right now. James didn't know what would have happened to him if he'd gotten there, but he knew he didn't want it to happen to Dr. Scott. He whipped out his phone to dial Area 14's emergency hotline, but the sudden movement sent his head spinning. He closed his eyes and waited for everything to stop moving before trying to look at his phone again. But by then, the headache had worsened, radiating out from his forehead and into both eye sockets. It wasn't the worst headache he'd ever had, but it was accompanied by a resurgence of the dizziness and a new wave of exhaustion. These must have been more after effects of that cognitohazard. Now that the adrenaline had worn off, he was finally feeling the brain strain. Determined to overcome the pain, the dizziness, and the tiredness, a man's life was in the balance. James still tried to call the hotline, but the numbers blurred and wavered before his eyes, sending his stomach rolling, and all he could do was collapse limply to the bed, clutching his head with one hand and letting the phone fall from the other. It lay there on the blanket, briefly forgotten, while James assured himself that he'd feel much better if he just closed his eyes for a second. It was already helping. The mattress and pillow, which normally felt stiff, flat, and uncomfortable, now seemed to gently cradle his aching head and limp body. It seemed like he'd never slept in a bed, and especially the bed that was so soft and cozy. But he distantly realized he was falling asleep now. One last panicked impulse rose to the surface, fighting to remember Dr. Scott and the phone lying just beyond his twitching fingertips. But it, too, was swallowed up by sleep. James awoke. He didn't open his eyes just yet, but he could still feel the pale light of the TV hitting his eyes, just as clearly as he could hear the faint muzak playing a song he almost remembered. He sat up groggily, lifting the cozy hotel sheets off himself in the process. How had he forgotten to turn off the TV? He rubbed his gritty eyes with one hand and reached for the remote on the nightstand with the other. He was just about to turn it off when the music was suddenly interrupted by a voice he almost recognized. "There's a hole in the wall at the bottom of the floor," it said. Then, before James could press the power button, the TV turned itself off. He sat, confused in the dark for a moment, thinking perhaps he'd just accidentally pressed the button or something. But then he heard the noise, a low, rhythmic thumping, like the slow beat of a massive heart. It was coming from the direction of the TV. Strangely unbothered by this, he calmly sat up against the headboard, and reached for the lamp. The light didn't reveal anything new, but the heartbeat continued. Like a man in a trance, James slid his bare feet into the cheap sandals he used as shower shoes and went to see what was the matter. The sound seemed to be coming from the wall behind the TV stand. Without the slightest hint of fear or worry, he squatted down beside the stand and pushed it aside. The heartbeat stopped immediately because James had found its source, an uncovered ventilation duct, scarcely more than a foot wide, extending deeper into the wall. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he crawled inside. Conrad noticed room 710's odd asymmetrical placement immediately. This, combined with its incongruous number, made him wonder if it had always been part of the building. Perhaps these unusual traits were another example of failed mimicry, like the garbled language of the online review. But the room looked normal enough otherwise, at least from the outside. There was no palatable sense of menace oozing from the edges of its white-paned door. Only the weird sensation of familiar unfamiliarity, common to all hotels. Still, though, Conrad was afraid. This was what he'd trekked across the country for. This was the culmination of years of research. This was the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. This was the Drooling path. Conrad looked carefully down the hall in both directions. Then, seeing no one, he reached for the door handle. His trembling hand moved with fearful slowness, as if the handle might suddenly lash out and bite it. But no such thing occurred. It turned like any other handle would, but the door stayed firmly shut. After an embarrassingly long time spent staring dumbly at the handle, Conrad realized the door was still locked. The tension suddenly dissipated, and Conrad had to laugh at himself while he fished for the key. He unlocked it, steeled himself with a deep breath, and carefully pushed open the door. Just like everything else so far, room 710 looked completely ordinary. Bathroom, closet, TV, 2 queen beds, and the usual assortment of miscellaneous, impractically small hotel furniture. Even after the door shut behind him, Conrad didn't feel or see anything unusual about the drab, slightly outdated furnishings. The place wasn't even dirty. They must have sent someone else in after the woman who'd quit. Someone who hadn't been so frightened by whatever was in here. Something on the TV. Before he could investigate that, though, he needed to pay the bathroom a visit. Conrad casually threw his travel bag on the nearest chair and went to relieve himself. He saw himself in the mirror while he was washing his hands, and had to look away from the desperate madman he saw there. He reminded himself that he wasn't nuts, just determined. Conrad's investigation began, of course, with the TV. He half expected a mutilated Ronald Reagan to appear on the screen as soon as he turned it on, but was greeted instead by music choice country. Conrad wasn't a fan of Toby Keith, but he was too focused on his mission to dig for a rock or metal channel. He wasn't here to headbang. The hotel had the usual obscenely large channel package, overflowing with infomercials, sitcoms, and pages of pay-per-view movies, including a selection of pornography with unpleasantly descriptive titles. He felt sorry for the parents of any children who stumbled across that during their vacation. Conrad was so distracted that he almost missed what he'd been looking for. It sat there at the bottom of the guide at a place that shouldn't have been possible. Channel 000, abbreviation RMN. It only showed one program, unhelpfully labeled Untitled, which seemed to last all day until it aired again at midnight. A press of the info button revealed that the channel's full name was Room News, but provided no other information. Conrad's heart was pounding, and his finger was itching to press the select button, but he stopped himself. Before exposing himself to whatever aired on Room News, he would need to take some precautions. With his eyes closed, he ran through the basic protective mental exercises he'd learned in memetics training. Nothing fancy, just a little bit of auto-hypnosis to fortify the mind. It wouldn't stop the worst hazards, but it would block the weakest ones and buy him some time against most everything else. Hopefully, he wouldn't need it. Once he was ready, Conrad hesitantly pressed the button, but kept his eyes closed so that he'd only have to face it one sense at a time. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting, but it certainly wasn't the mellow elevator music that he heard. Conrad's eyebrows furrowed in confusion, but he made sure to mute the TV before he opened his eyes. His eyes were just as disappointed as his ears, though, when they beheld nothing more exciting than the picture of a sailboat. He unmuted the TV, wondering if the sound and visuals might meld together into something different, but still only heard the same elevator music. He stared at the screen for a long time, hoping that something would change, but had no such luck. Room News was odd, sure, but it certainly wasn't enough to make someone quit their job on the spot. Jess said it had been something about the TV, though, so Conrad stepped forward to examine the device itself. It looked just like any other TV, at least from the front. He peered over the top and saw nothing out of the ordinary. It was very close to the wall, though, so if he wanted a proper look, he'd need to move it. He slid it carefully forward and turned it as far to the side as the available space permitted, then peeked around the side to see if anything else would come to light. As it turned out, something did. "Aha!" he cried, upon seeing the little red bump stuck to the back of the TV, near the bottom where it hadn't been visible from above. It was a small dome, no wider than his thumbnail. It glistened wetly in the light, resembling nothing so much as a massive pimple. He began to reach for it, but then he remembered the biohazard protocol that are drilled into everyone at Area 14, and stopped himself. Instead, he carefully moved his head closer to squint at it up close. It wasn't moving, but there was a shiny trail of thick, transparent slime oozing out from under it and running down the back of the set. The goop seemed to evaporate before it reached the bottom, though, since none of it dripped onto the table. He said. If that mucus was seeping from under it, that meant it wasn't necessarily attached to the TV. Maybe it could be pried off. Conrad stepped back and scanned the room for anything he could use as a decent substitute for gloves. Maybe he could peel that weird plastic wrapper off of one of the coffee cups. No, that would be too slippery. Instead, Conrad hurried to the bathroom and grabbed one of the provided washcloths. Then he returned to the TV and with extreme care placed the cloth over the boil. He gripped it through the paper, gritting his teeth against its disgusting half-solid texture, and carefully wedged his fingers under it. He wiggled it slightly back and forth, careful not to exert too much pressure, lest he accidentally rupture it. Then, with a loud, wet pop, it separated from the plastic. Immediately, the mellow music was replaced by a blast of white noise. Conrad leaned over to see the screen, which was now displaying only static. Then he looked back at the fleshy growth in his hand, the part of it that had been attached to the TV now visible in the folds of the washcloth. It wasn't much to look at, just a smooth, slimy expanse of red flesh, but it must have been creating room news somehow. This suspicion was confirmed when Conrad rechecked the guide from which that channel was now missing. Interesting, he murmured. He looked down at the boil again, but it remained inert. What was this thing? Why did it create such a seemingly harmless channel? How was that connected to the hazardous review? There was still a piece missing. Conrad eyed the plastic cups for the coffee maker. If a containment team were here, they'd take a sample of the growth and run a battery of tests on it. But he couldn't do that here, and he didn't feel like taking it with him in such a flimsy container. It would be too easy to lose, and then that analysis might never happen. Or he might accidentally touch it and find out the hard way if that mucus was toxic. With that unpleasant thought in mind, Conrad decided he'd best put the nasty thing down before its slime soaked through the cloth. After some internal deliberation, he decided to just put it back on the TV. The television was still the center of the mystery, and he hoped that it might do something interesting if he reattached the growth. He was not disappointed. The boil adhered back to the plastic on contact, and Room News immediately came back online. It wasn't playing music anymore, though. As 058's haunting voice slithered out of the speakers, a chill slithered up his spine. Not just because he found that horrible voice in such an unexpected place, or because it indisputably confirmed the connection between 058 and this hotel room, but because it was actually making sense. "I have something to tell you," said from the voice, and in that moment Conrad had no doubt that it was speaking directly to him. "What?" he asked, breathless, but the voice on the TV, the voice of 058, the voice of darkness, had not paused for a response. "Something that might change your life," it continued. "It certainly changed mine." Realizing now that the TV, 058, it, wasn't actually addressing him, Conrad scrambled across the room to where a pen and notepad sat beside the phone. He wished he'd had a recorder ready, but frantic note scribbling would have to do. You work too much, all the time in fact. Why? You don't enjoy it, who would? There's nothing enjoyable about spending your life locked up in the worst combination of military base and hospital imaginable, wondering what will kill you first. Will some horrible monster break out of its cage and tear you limb from limb? Or maybe the cleanup crew wasn't as thorough as they should have been, and there's still a little bit of some horrible pathogen smeared on a batch of wall you brushed against this morning. Or maybe you'll get lucky and your bosses will order a nuclear strike before the horrors you study can get to you. A wave of cold dread settled on Conrad as he realized that his first impression had been correct. It was, in fact, talking to him. It's hard knowing that the O5 Council thinks you're just as disposable as the men in orange jumpsuits and would do away with you just as quickly if the need arose. It shouldn't be this way, should it? They said you'd be saving the world, keeping people safe from things they weren't meant to know, things that would drive them insane if they did. Things like the one that took your wife away, but that was a lie. Heroes have better things to do than sit in disorganized offices poring over endless files and recordings and searching for an answer that doesn't exist. Sometimes your mind gets so exhausted from listening and reading that your body forgets it hasn't moved all day and you become tired enough to sleep. So you shuffle in a daze back to your miserable little apartment in a different miserable corner of the same miserable base as your miserable little office. A herd of cattle is being unloaded from a truck and led to a drab grey warehouse that looks just like your office building. The Foundation doesn't waste resources on giving them a nice place to live, since they'll all be fed to the creatures in the basement before the end of the month. You don't watch as the dumb animals are led to their deaths because it's occurred to you more than once that your accommodations aren't all that different from theirs, just a small, dirty box inside a larger, dirtier box. At least the cows are too dumb to know they're suffering. Your apartment is cold. Worse, it's quiet. This place feels even less like home than your office. You strip off your dirty clothes and collapse on the bed, hoping the worn-out covers on the wobbly bed you bought from an Ikea in Fishkill, New York 5 years ago will keep you warm enough to sleep. Before you close your aching, bloodshot eyes, you look over at a picture of your wife still visible in the thin rays of sunlight cutting through the flimsy blinds. You tell yourself that you love her, that you always did and always will, but that's just because deep down you know that no living woman would have the crazy old man you've become. Then you try to sleep, but it doesn't work because they're flirting artillery over in the part of the base where New 7 trains, and the explosions keep rattling your windows. You lie there and stare at the ceiling and try not to think about the life wasting away around you and within you until nothing remains but a dull-eyed scarecrow with a head full of nonsense. Conrad was shaking, but he didn't know if it was with anger or fear or something else entirely. He tried to keep his hands steady so he could write the hurtful words as clearly as he heard them. You've got to get out of here. Put on some clean clothes and haul yourself out of bed. Tell the area director you're taking a vacation. Take your deteriorating car away from that cold, lifeless apartment in the dingy grey rectangle you call a workplace and go. Leave behind the files, the recordings, the monsters, and the towering walls. This place is a prison, but you can leave for the weekend. You don't have to tell them you're not coming back. There's only one place to go, a hotel, not a motel. The rooms there are just as tiny and dirty as the one you're escaping. You need something nicer, a place where you can feel like a brand new person, like a real person. Aren't hotels wonderful? A nice warm room all to yourself, kept neat and clean and stocked with toilet paper by someone you never have to see or talk to if you don't want to. They even make the food served up every morning and evening in a shiny modern buffet for you and all your fellow travelers. You can wonder who they are and how they got here. Perhaps they walked empty down Drooling path just like you. Conrad quickly underlined that dreadful phrase, though in his haste he almost crossed it out instead. Here at the hotel you are whole. The wallpaper and the paintings on it are so brightly colored, so much kinder than the bare walls of that horrible place up in the mountains. The bed is soft and comfortable, with clean, warm covers on it. The pool is just the right temperature and free of noisy children, so you can float around in peace and take some of the weight off your bad knees. You feel younger than you've been in decades. You could stay here forever, eating scones and nachos and popcorn and drinking from the mini bar and sleeping in that wonderful bed. And perhaps you should stay forever. Once you leave, everything will go back to normal, the wasting away of your body, your mind, and your career, the emptiness, the sadness, the blackness, the darkness. The hotel will stay with you, though. Stay with the hotel. Be the hotel. You are it, is everything. You are the hotel. Ascend. Then the voice paused. Conrad's head whipped up to look at the screen, desperately hanging on for anything else, any other clues, no matter how much they hurt. But all it had left to say was, "Won't that be nice?" Then, absurdly, that same damn music song started playing again. Conrad gaped at that stupid sailboat for almost a minute until he could no longer deny that the monologue was over. Then he finally allowed himself to sob, only once, but very loudly. He clasped his free hand to his eyes, holding back tears. Somehow, the thing that voice belonged to had known everything about him, right down to the hidden personal despair that had sent him on this insane quest in the first place. He didn't know what he'd expected, but it certainly hadn't been a verbal beatdown from SCP-058. The second half of the monologue was almost as perplexing, seeming to be nothing more than yet another disturbing advertisement for the hotel. But as they teach you on your first day with the Memetics Division, first impressions are often misleading. Steeling himself against the mockery within, Conrad carefully combed back over his hastily scrawled transcript, searching for any clues he might have missed the first time. There was the reference to the ever-present path, of course, though it was just as difficult to decipher. Of more note, however, was the phrase, "walked empty." Conrad didn't need to reference 1981's document to recognize that phrase from one of its transcripts. He recognized the emptiness, the sadness, the blackness, the darkness from 1981 as well, confirming that it was connected much more closely with 058 and the hotel than he'd initially suspected. Still, Conrad doubted the lump he'd pried off the TV was the source of the whole anomaly. If that little clot of flesh and mucus had been capable of churning out cognitohazards and giant flame-spewing cow-heart scorpion things, he'd have been dead by now. But it was definitely part of the same anomaly, which meant that the entity writing the hazardous reviews was most likely the same one ultimately responsible for Room News. Maybe that was 058 itself, though the hotel anomalies indicated much greater intelligence than the Heart of Darkness seemed to possess. More likely, Conrad surmised, the being that created these things was simply broadcasting its voice through both the boil on the TV and the monstrous heart back at Area 14, and maybe Ronald Reagan cut up while talking, too. Perhaps the owner of the voice was the dark, hooded figure that did the cutting in that video. Conrad had tried to talk to that figure once, but it hadn't had much to say then, just a big red "I see you" that Conrad still saw in his nightmares. Then it had never reared its hooded head again, and Conrad had been banished to that miserable base in the mountains that even Room News agreed was a dump. For a moment he wondered if both SCP-058 and the hotel had been that same entity's convoluted attempts to respond to him, but quickly dismissed that selfish notion. 058 had killed hundreds of people long before Conrad arrived, and anyone could have stumbled across that review. Jess had even said that people stayed in room 710 all the time. No, this anomaly didn't care a thing for him. He was just the first one to put all the pieces together. Well, not all of them. He had more answers now than when he'd started, but even more questions. Questions like, where did that boil come from? And was this the voice of SCP-1981-1? And what is that effing song? And how does this thing know the intimate details of my past? It knew about his job, the Foundation, what had happened to Allison, even his private existential dread. It even knew where he'd bought his furniture. Wait. No, it didn't. Conrad read over his notes again. Fishkill, New York? Conrad had never been there, not to any part of the state, and he hadn't bought his bed from Ikea either. The Foundation had provided it. How, with everything it knew about him, had it made that mistake, and such a specific error? Perhaps it hadn't been an error at all. Conrad turned off the TV with its increasingly annoying music and got out his laptop. He wasn't the least bit surprised by what Google Maps found in Fishkill. It was time for a trip to Ikea. Make you wanna cry. I've looked into the heart of darkness. James was running for his life. His bare feet padded almost silently on the hotel's brown and gold carpet, so the loudest sounds were his gasping breath and the pounding heartbeat in his ears. That and the howling. The predators had started after him as soon as he emerged from room 710, slinking out of a room down the hall like so many vicious dogs. He hadn't a clue how they'd managed to open the hotel door with their armored paws, but one look at their teeth told him it wouldn't be safe to stick around and ask. Unfortunately for James, he might soon be out of other options. Adrenaline can only get you so far when you haven't run since the last time a PE teacher forced you to. And right now, the predator's clawed feet were getting them much farther. Another piercing howl echoed down the hallway's seemingly infinite length. James cast a frantic glance over his shoulder and felt sick when he saw how close the pack was getting. Running wasn't going to work. Then up ahead, James saw his way out, a big door labeled swimming pool. He didn't know if the predators could swim, but he certainly could. He skidded to a halt, burning the soles of his feet on the carpet. He staggered through the door, still off balance from his sudden stop, and flagrantly defied a no running sign. A swarm of enormous gray bugs skittered away from James's feet as they slapped on the cold concrete. He accidentally flattened one with a loud crunch, but paid it no attention. Then, finally, he leapt from the edge and plunged into the water. Gasping, James rose back to the surface. The pool water was uncomfortably warm, but James fought through the new wave of nausea brought on by the sudden temperature change and paddled out to the deep end. Just as he reached the deepest part of the pool, he heard the wolves at the door. There were 6 of them in all, massive canine monsters with heads covered in bony armor plates. Sharp claws clicked on the concrete, slavering jaws snapped at the air, and ululating howls rang loudly beneath the high concrete ceiling. The creatures spread out, circling the pool and the gasping research assistant treading water at its center. James turned frantically in the water, trying to watch all 6 of the wolves at once, terrified that they might know how to swim. But they did not jump in. They just stood there, tensed and ready to pounce. James was confused at first, but then he realized what was happening. They were going to wait him out. No way could he tread water that long. He'd have to make his way back to the shallow end of the pool where he could stand. In retrospect, it had probably been unnecessary to swim to the deep end anyway. The wolves wouldn't fare any better in 4 feet of water than in 10. So, under the wary gaze of the wolves' beady eyes, he swam back to the shallow part of the pool. Or at least, what should have been the shallow part. James looked down. Something was terribly wrong. There was no bottom beneath his feet, only darkness. The rough blue walls of the pool plunged 20 feet down or more, but beyond that, the illumination from the ceiling lights petered out to the nothing. It was like being lost at sea. He looked back up at the wolves, still waiting patiently for their prey to tire out and crawl ashore. "Get out of here!" he yelled, splashing water at the nearest one. It hardly flinched as the water hit it, droplets rumming harmlessly off its armored head. "I said get!" he repeated, splashing more violently this time. Surprisingly, that worked. The wolf leapt back a few steps, then ran back into the hallway with its tail between its legs. Even more miraculously, the other 5 followed suit, whining quietly as they fled. James couldn't believe it, but he wasn't going to question his success. He started making his way towards the nearest ladder. All that running, not to mention treading water in his pajamas, had worn him out. James wasn't a proficient swimmer. He knew how to not drown, but he'd never gotten much further than that. Like a lot of kids, James had always been afraid to put his face in the water, something that he had outgrown as an adult. He made sure to keep his head above the surface as he paddled to the ladder, which was unfortunate, or else he might have seen the tentacle before it closed around his leg. James instinctively sucked in one last gasp of air before he was dragged under, but he quickly wasted it by struggling in vain against the slimy appendage's crushing grip. He looked down through the clear water and only saw more tentacles, dozens of them, wriggling up out of the bottomless darkness to embrace him with their tooth-lined suckers. One went to close around his body, and he tried to swat it away, but it just wrapped around his arm instead. He had to fight a cry of pain as the tentacles squeezed, bruising flesh and cracking bone in their relentless grip. He thrashed fruitlessly at the limbs encircling him, but could do nothing to stop their relentless assault as more of them closed around his other limbs, his torso, and his neck. The tentacle around his chest squeezed out the last of his air, and he watched in dumb desperation as it bubbled away to the increasingly distant surface. Just before he lost consciousness, James thought he heard the snapping of a massive beak somewhere below. As soon as she saw him stumble back into the lobby, half a zipped bag in hand, Jess knew that Conrad had found whatever he was looking for. It was in his wild, bloodshot eyes. "What did you—" she began as he reached the desk. "New room," he gasped. "What?" "I need a new room," he swallowed loudly. "Please." She leaned toward him to whisper, but he jerked back away from her. "What did you find?" she asked. He shook his head vigorously. "Classified." "But you did find something." He nodded reluctantly. "Don't tell anyone." He wasn't particularly worried about it. The Foundation would surely track him down eventually, and they'd have a dose of amnestics with Jess's name on it. "What happens now?" "Some people will be here to deal with it, but right now I really just need another room, please. I can't sleep in there." Jess looked even more confused than before, but she began the process of finding him a new room. "I'll just say that it wasn't cleaned properly." "Thank you." Jess tried a few times to probe Conrad about his discovery in room 710, but he continued to evade her questions until she finally handed over the new key. He ignored her as he staggered away, because the only thing on his mind now was some much-needed sleep. He still made sure to stick to the opposite side of the hall when he walked past room 710, though. In movies, people wake abruptly from their nightmares, shooting into a sitting position with eyes wide open. This is not what happened to James. His awakening was slow and agonizing. The overheated pool water was one and the same with this room's stifling, stagnant air, and the tentacle around his neck was indistinguishable from his shirt, twisted up under his wriggling body until its collar pressed uncomfortably on his throat. He was gasping for breath, but he was also struggling to scream. All that came out was a quiet, guttural groan. He strained his limbs, wrestling against imaginary tentacles and the lingering paralysis of sleep. Only when the blackness covered over him in the pool was he finally able to open his eyes in the waking world. For a long, painful moment, James thought he was somehow still in room 710. But then he recognized his dismal room at Area 14, and for the first time was relieved to see it. James grimaced as he sat up. His headache had diminished some, but now it was joined by aches in his neck and back, courtesy of the awkward position he'd fallen asleep in. Something fell to the floor with a muted thump. James peered over the edge of the bed and saw that it was his phone. His phone! Gah! James cried, rolling ungracefully out of bed and onto the floor beside it. He pawed frantically at the device. How long had he been asleep? It could already be too late. The emergency hotline answered on the first ring. Much to his surprise, Conrad slept well. He supposed the exhaustion he'd accumulated over the last several days, or honestly years, of not sleeping enough had finally managed to overwhelm the cocktail of stress, anxiety, and dread that normally kept him up at night. And the best part was that he didn't even remember dreaming. When he got out from under the sheets that Sunday morning, it felt like stepping out of a long, hot, relaxing shower. He was fresher than he'd been in years, and incredibly, felt more excited about his trip to Ikea than worried. This was what he lived for, after all, what he had signed up for in the first place. He hadn't expected that waging war against mimetic anomalies and deciphering the coded messages of Ronald Reagan would involve cross-country trips to hotels and furniture stores. Of course, but Foundationers learned to expect the unexpected. To Conrad's relief, Jess was not still on duty when he checked out. The process went smoothly, and before he knew it, he was on his way to Fishkill, with a McDonald's bag in the passenger seat. He popped some Mastodon into the CD player with one hand, then grabbed a breakfast burrito. He even caught himself singing along. Once or twice. His good mood didn't last forever, though. That's because 2 hours later, he saw a road sign for Scranton. It was always weird seeing that name on things that weren't reality anchors, but that little oddity, a mere quirk of reference frames, wasn't what disturbed him. It was the thought of what had happened to the great Robert Scranton. Conrad skipped into the void because it suddenly seemed wildly inappropriate. Well, he sighed, maybe they'll name something after me too. The Scott Ward Salad Spinner, SWOSS. Then he started giggling. Maybe it was just because the people in the memetics division have a weird sense of humor. Or maybe it was because he just realized that he didn't particularly care if he was about to die or not. Jess had wanted to come in early that day, but George refused to allow such a last-minute schedule adjustment, with even more vehemence than usual. By then she felt sure that he was somehow in on whatever was happening in room 710. Hopefully he wouldn't fire her, or, she increasingly worried, do something much worse, when he noticed that she'd moved a customer out of there. But she didn't particularly care about that right now. Right now, she was just hoping that Conrad wouldn't check out before she got to Atherton. She knew it was too late before she ever pulled into the parking lot, though, because she could see that there were already 10 white vans with heavily tinted windows parked in it. Self-preservation got the better of her curiosity, so she just kept going. As much as she might want to know what was happening in there, it wasn't worth getting mind-wiped or disappeared by the men in black. Unlike Jess, George was already at work. That's why 3 men with black suits and reflective shades had just entered his office. 2 others were questioning the kid at the desk, and several more guys in what looked like hazmat suits were marching down the hallway. George didn't have to wonder what room they were headed for. He looked up at the men in black and groaned. It was Jess, wasn't it? Sergeant Marcus Thorpe of Mobile Task Force Lambda 14 adjusted his glasses. We'll be asking the questions here, mister. Unfortunately for Conrad Scott, the 1-star reviewers cordoning off the Atherton Hotel weren't the only agents dispatched as a result of James's call. Some cybersecurity agents followed his credit card to the airport in Pittsburgh, his rental car to Scranton, and his search history to Fishkill. Then a team of field agents were dispatched to his probable destination, a perfectly normal, regular old Ikea. Conrad had been growing increasingly nervous ever since he'd crossed the state line. His luck had held out so far, but he wasn't sure how much farther he'd be able to get before the Foundation tracked him down. Surely they'd have noticed he wasn't where he could be reasonably expected to be. A trip to State College was odd, but checking out the next morning and making a beeline for some random fly speck 4 hours away didn't make any sense at all. He just hoped he'd get there before they caught up. The CDs ran out an hour from Fishkill, leaving Conrad with a nervous pit in his stomach, a distracting ringing in his ears, and Mother stuck in his head. He dug restlessly on the radio, but couldn't find a decent rock station, only the mindless drivel that teenagers and rednecks listened to. Those knuckleheads wouldn't have known music if it slapped him upside the head with a Strat coaster. Conrad had owned a Strat once, a Christmas gift from his mother, but he'd never played it quite as much as he should have, never had quite enough dedication to get good or enough talent to start that way, and never had enough friends to start a band in the first place. That old black Strat had grown dusty and guilt-laden under his bed in college, then in a closet at his house. Sometimes Allison had asked him why he never played it. He'd always answered that he was too busy, but really it was because Conrad was not the kind of person who played guitars and joined bands. He was the kind of person who sat at a desk and hunched over books and computers. He just never had the guts for anything else. Not until now, anyway. Conrad shook his head to clear it. This was no time to dwell on the past. He was finally close to actually accomplishing something for once. He could almost taste it as he saw the blue and yellow building rise into view up ahead. This was it. Conrad walked as fast as he could without looking suspicious to the other customers in the lot. He felt silly for a passing moment, trying to surreptitiously enter a Swedish furniture store. This definitely wasn't how he'd pictured his life turning out. He had, however, anticipated that there might be some agents there to greet him, and the memetics people are nothing if not observant. That's why he spotted the various plainclothes agents sitting in their cars, chatting on their radios, and trying hard not to obviously stare at him. He was a little worried they might jump out and try to catch him before he made it inside, but that didn't seem to be the plan. They were probably going to wait for him to get inside, then cordon off the building and make everyone leave through the same exit. Then they'd search the whole thing to ferret him out. Hopefully he'd find what he was looking for, and know it when he saw it, before they got to him. With that thought in mind, and knowing he had no more use for subtlety, he broke into a run. As soon as Dr. Scott dashed through the automatic doors, the agents in the parking lot sprung into action. Some fanned out around the sides to cover the other exits, while others stayed by the front door to keep an eye on those leaving. Someone made their way to the office and announced that the store was closing early and everyone needed to leave. The shoppers gawped at the man ushering them out with pistols and radios at their hips, but a few flashed badges, local police allegedly, were enough to convince them to move along. Unsurprisingly, Dr. Scott was not among those leaving the store. It was surprising, however, that none of the agents searching the market hall were able to find him. It was confusing when he wasn't discovered in the self-service area either, and downright perplexing when he didn't turn up in the showroom. More agents were called and more thorough searches were held, but Dr. Scott never appeared. It was as if he'd somehow managed to slip out of Ikea unnoticed, despite all the exits being blocked and guarded. When 2 of the agents went missing too, it was clear that some anomaly was at work, and the field team called for backup. But even though Dr. Scott was gone, he had not left Ikea. Conrad noticed the change immediately. He kept running for a bit longer to make sure he wasn't being chased, then stopped to catch his breath and figure out exactly what had changed. The floors were the same kind of tile, and the twisting aisles of umlaut-ridden furniture were just as confusingly laid out as normal. Then he looked up, and it was obvious. The ceiling of the Ikea, instead of its previously reasonable position, was now at a height more appropriate for an aircraft carrier. "Huh," he panted, for lack of anything better to say. Conrad stood on his tiptoes and peered as best he could over the shelves, which wasn't very far. The ceiling clearly stretched for much further to the sides than would have been possible in a normal Ikea, though. He also noticed that none of the signs hanging from the ceiling said exit. Hopefully that meant the agents couldn't pursue him into whatever infinite furniture nightmare he was now living. But he decided to keep moving, just in case. He didn't run this time, though. That brief sprint had exacerbated all the various aches and pains that had built up in his assorted joints over the long car ride, and it was the best he could do to maintain a walk. It was too bad Ikea didn't sell Tylenol. After 2 hours of walking in what was roughly a straight line, punctuated by a few brief rests on the abundant comfy chairs, Conrad was starting to get annoyed. Wherever he was, it was clearly infinite, or at least anomalously large. Not recursive either, as he'd been paying attention to the dangling ceiling signs to make sure he wasn't going in circles. Despite that, he'd seen nothing but endless rows of fine Swedish furniture. There didn't seem to be anyone else in this oversized Ikea dimension either. Business was slow, he supposed. As if in answer to this thought, someone walked past the end of the aisle. Conrad only saw them for a second, but he recognized the blue and yellow uniform of Ikea staff. It felt ridiculous asking the staff of an extra-dimensional anomaly for directions to the nearest drooling path, but it was better than just wandering around aimlessly. "Excuse me," he called, walking after the person he'd glimpsed. "Could you—" He didn't finish his question, because it was suddenly clear that this staff member was not, in fact, a person. It was about the height of one, but only because its bizarrely long legs compensated for its freakishly compressed torso. Its arms were a normal length, at least. The creature didn't respond to Conrad's voice, and he considered hightailing it in the other direction before it noticed him. But, in what had apparently become a very dangerous habit, he let his curiosity win out over self-preservation. Conrad carefully walked after it as it continued to weave aimlessly down the aisle. He tried to get a look at its face, only to discover there was none. It was a testament to Dr. Scott's experience with the Foundation that he wasn't all that surprised. He was more upset that it wasn't wearing a name tag, which might have at least provided some clue about the native language of this furniture hell. The thing still didn't react to him, even though it would have seen him if it had had eyes, so he decided to stop pushing his luck and head in the opposite direction. "Yep," he grumbled. "Seems like the kind of place 58 would shop." After yet another hour of Conrad in Sofa Land, he had progressed from annoyed to pissed. He hadn't flushed his sad excuse of a career and the remainder of his life down the metaphorical toilet to starve to death in the mother of all Ikeas. Dehydration would be the real enemy, of course, but now it was his grumbling stomach that demanded relief. Steak and Shake had been a very long time ago. So long ago, in fact, that once he found something to eat, Conrad would probably need to find an aisle of bathroom fixtures. Hopefully the faceless employees wouldn't take issue with using the display toilets. He'd only seen one other since the first, a misshapen creature with stumpy limbs and a bloated torso, milling around among some refrigerators. It had seemed just as oblivious to him as the first one, though he hadn't gone out of his way to get its attention. Maybe they couldn't see at all, what with not having eyes. But then again, lack of eyes had never slowed 058 down any. Then the sweet smell of Swedish meatballs hit Conrad's nostrils, and any worries about faceless Ikea staff were swept away by the prospect of food. He followed his nose to what looked like a completely normal Ikea restaurant. Normal, that is, except for the total lack of any other patrons. There weren't any deformed staff manning the counter either, though, so it wasn't all bad. He did look around for them before appropriating some meatballs from the display, though, just to make sure. He had a feeling those things might be a little less tolerant of shoplifting than human employees. The food and drink was fresh and delicious, which was exceedingly strange, but Conrad tried not to worry about it. The logistics of an infinite Ikea dimension probably weren't going to make much sense from any angle. He was still vaguely pondering the image of a gangly, faceless monster taking pastries out of the oven when he noticed the phone. It hung there on the wall behind the counter, its spiraling cord a tantalizing chance at communication. He glanced around himself again. Still no staff in sight. Carefully, he made his way behind the counter. Conrad didn't hesitate to pick up the phone. He was too desperate for something to actually happen to worry about what might be on the other end. He wasn't surprised when 058's voice slithered out of the earpiece. In fact, he grinned triumphantly. "Hello?" he asked. "Fed to the mollified mongrels of dystopian caricatures. Hello? To slip the skin from that which cannot. 58? Plumbed the ocular waterfalls, queen wonders. Anybody? I came then upon the technical attraction to timely perforation of coronal." "Damn it," he shouted. "I'm here. I followed the clues. Now what do you want from me?" "Scolopendra of the flagellate bedecked carnifex I have seen." "Ah!" Conrad howled in frustration, flinging the phone away from himself. It bounced once off the floor before springing back on its cord to dangle mockingly below the receiver. He could still faintly hear 058's gibberish issuing from it. He glared angrily at it for a second, but then he had an idea. He snatched the phone back up and shouted into it, "The Drooling Path!" "To the place where the cities bow to times of hate and dive to embrace the Drooling Path," he repeated, now almost screaming. "Chill of stillborn moonrise, the single wayward gift of—" "I've walked empty down Drooling Path, been coming to this region for 14 stone. Now there you go again. I see you." The cold aeon light of patriarchs humidified, placed in dust, and made to. Conrad sighed, and all the anger went out of him. Had he really come all this way, endured so much, to wind up exactly where he'd been before he started? Deflated, Dr. Conrad Scott slumped against the counter. Still holding the phone with one shaking hand, he used the other to fish out the battered notepad and tiny pencil from the hotel. Then, with bitter tears stinging his eyes, he started transcribing. James bounced his leg, shifted in his seat, looked around the waiting area, and otherwise tried to diffuse his nerves. He was probably annoying Dr. McLean's secretary with his constant fidgeting, but she didn't show it, if only because that would have required her to stop ignoring him. James had only spoken directly with the area director once before. Shortly after his arrival at ABCA 14, McLean always made an effort to greet new arrivals, either to berate them for whatever mistake had earned them a reassignment, or to offer condolences to new recruits, like James himself, who'd done nothing to deserve such an unpleasant first assignment. James had never been able to figure out if the director's apology had been genuine or a subtle attempt to scare him into line. Maybe both. He was similarly confused by the circumstances of this meeting. Would he be congratulated for leading the Foundation to a new anomaly, or would he be berated for failing to respond properly or quickly enough? James couldn't help but feel that Dr. Scott might have lived if he'd done something different, listened to the CD earlier, not fallen asleep after fighting the cognitohazard, or changing some other choice that he messed up without even realizing it. James' constant worrying was interrupted by Director McLean. "All right," he called from his office. "Come on in." Reluctantly, James got to his feet and shuffled to the door, avoiding eye contact with the secretary as he passed. Not that she tried to make any. "Director?" he asked. McLean nodded at the chair in front of his desk. "Have a seat." James swallowed nervously, then approached the desk and settled nervously on the edge of the chair. "For goodness sake, man, relax." James leaned back a tiny bit and attempted to smile, but ended up grimacing. "Sorry." "Oh, you think you're in trouble, don't you?" Am I?" McLean chuckled. "Of course not. Quite the opposite." "Really?" he asked, finally starting to relax. "Really? You've done the Foundation a service." "I have?" "Yep. That hotel room, the one you reported, is our newest skip." "Ours?" he asked, looking around as if the hotel might jump out from behind a filing cabinet. "Well, not ours. It's still in the hotel. Not sure whose jurisdiction that is. Probably 179. But it's sure not us, anyway. Neither is the other anomaly you led us to." "Other anomaly?" This was the first James had heard of that. McLean was surprised. "Didn't anybody tell you what happened?" He shook his head, then looked away. "Only that Dr. Scott didn't make it." "Well, sort of." James looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "He's not dead, we don't think." "He's not?" James straightened up. "Nope. He just ran off into whatever extra-dimensional bullshit is in that Ikea." "Oh," he said, slumping again. "Wait, Ikea?" James wondered if he'd misheard. "Yeah, a big Ikea up in New York somewhere. He went there after the hotel. It's like a portal to some infinite furniture dimension or something. I don't know. They wouldn't tell me much, and I'm not supposed to tell you anything, but I figured you deserved to know." "Oh, thanks?" He wasn't entirely sure if he should be grateful, because he was worried that this breach of information security might be the prelude to some involuntary amnesticization. The director smiled. No, thank you. That's 2 Euclids in 1 day, secured, contained, and protected because of your quick thinking. James looked down in embarrassment. Not quick enough, he muttered. What do you... Oh, you think Scott was your fault, don't you? Before James could stop himself, it all came flowing out. I shouldn't have fallen asleep. If I'd stayed awake and called the hotline sooner, then maybe... Whoa, kid, relax. Conrad got what he wanted. What? James spluttered. Trust me, I knew the guy for a long time. The whole time he worked here, 058 was his obsession. To go out like this, on some epic quest across the country, finally solving the mystery of that thing, and maybe of 19812, too. If what he said to Glass on Friday is true, it's what he would have wanted. If he found what he was looking for, then maybe he can finally get some rest. If not, well, at least he's out of his misery. That did little to make James feel better. I guess so, he said quietly. Speaking of which, McLean said, pointing for emphasis, I've got an offer for you. An offer? That's right. Not to be morbid, but there is a big opening on the 058 project now, and you are the new expert on this drooling path business. With his other hand, the director brandished the stolen 058 CD. James had guiltily turned it over as soon as he'd heard of Dr. Scott's fate. No, James blurted, surprising even himself. The director was taken aback. I mean, he hastily continued, please no. I think I've had enough of that for the rest of my life. I see, McLean said, nodding amicably. He slipped the CD back into whatever desk drawer it had come from. How about a reassignment, then? To a different object? He asked, somewhat hopefully. He'd love to put some distance between himself and 058, but then again, none of ABCA 14's other objects were teddy bears either. The self-eating sailor was probably the least disturbing one. How about a different site? What? He was incredulous. The director smiled knowingly. I don't get the chance to save somebody from this shithole often. When I do, I like to make sure it's someone who deserves it. I mean, this was your first assignment. That's just unfair. James finally allowed himself to smile, and it was a big one. Thank you. Hey, don't thank me yet. I haven't told you where you're going. Then he winked. James blanched. So he was in trouble after all. They were going to send him to Area 2 or something. He just knew it. Then the director laughed. Relax, kid. I'm just messing with you. You're going to 17. Site 17? He sputtered. That had to be too good to be true. I mean, unless you want to stay here. No, he said, a bit more desperately than he'd meant to. I mean, thank you. Don't mention it, he said, extending his hand for a shake. Seriously, don't mention it. I pulled some strings. James grinned even wider than before as he shook the director's hand. I won't, Director, I promise. When do I leave? Still ironing out the details, but I'd go ahead and start packing if I were you. The director nodded towards the door to make sure James didn't miss that cue to leave. Right away, sir. Then he turned to go, still smiling. Oh, James? Yes, sir? He stopped at the door and looked back. Tell that asshole to come in on your way out, would you? Sure. Thanks. James nodded, then continued on his way. He didn't have time to ponder who the asshole might be, because none other than Dr. Ames Johnston was sitting in the waiting area. They were equally surprised to see each other. James? Dr. Johnston? Then James realized what was about to happen, and his smile grew even wider. The director's ready to see you. Then he hurried out of the room before his perplexed former superior could figure it out. Dr. Johnston was still confused when he entered the office of Dr. McLean, who was no longer smiling. "Take a seat," he said. "And after you do that, why don't you explain to me exactly why you sent D067 into SCP-058's containment chamber?" "What?" "I went over 058's documentation again the other day, and it just seemed a little strange to me that you didn't use the built-in sound system in that chamber instead. Why was that?" Johnston began, but it turned out to have been a rhetorical question. "Ds aren't expendable, you know. And if there's one thing I hate more than arrogant assholes who take joy in their coworkers' misfortune, send mistreated research assistants to do their dirty work, and take stuff from people's offices without permission, it's wastefulness." He repeated. "Tell me, Ames, do you know what exponential recombination is?" He gulped. "Yes, sir." "Good. It happened to somebody yesterday, and now I've got an opening to fill." Johnston blanched. "What?" he stammered. "Don't worry. I'll have someone collect the 058 tapes from your office." Conrad had lost track of how long he'd been in the Ikea. He'd spent most of that time transcribing 058's fresh load of bullshit. It wasn't going well. There was nothing new here, or rather, there was everything new. No repeat phrases, not even that damned drooling path. Just more and more indecipherable gibberish. Maybe if he'd still had his notes, he could have cross-referenced and found something meaningful. But with nothing but the phone and a notepad, he was effectively starting from scratch. The only reason he hadn't given up already was because he wouldn't know what else to do if he did. At least he was too busy frantically writing to think too much about his sorry situation. Foundation personnel learn early on that things can always get worse, but knowing it's going to happen rarely makes it any easier to deal with. That's why when the lights shut off with a startling thunk, Conrad shouts, in equal parts surprise and frustration. The phone slipped out of his sweaty hand when he jumped, rattling loudly as it bounced off the counter and then the floor. 058's whispers mocked him as it dangled somewhere near his feet. "Damn it, damn it, damn it," he muttered, trying to fish out his key ring. There was a little flashlight on there. It didn't have much battery life, but hopefully it'd be enough to find something soft to sleep on. He didn't have much else to do with the lights off. Naturally, the keys snagged on his pants, yanked themselves out of his hand, and clattered unseen to the floor. "Damn it." Grunting, Conrad dropped to his cramped hands and aching knees to fumble for the keys. Damn frickin' drooling path, keys, flashlight, stupid ass hotel, 58, Gorbachev, bullshit, midden sundowns, and friggin' lamb trees, and autumn nameless slug that crawls electricity from eye to evening. Aha! Triumphantly, he grasped the flashlight and turned it on with a click. Then he tried to stand up and immediately smacked his head on the bottom of the counter. "Shit!" he cried. Carefully, Conrad crawled backwards until he was clear. He noticed the whispering phone dangling beside his head, so he grabbed it as he creaked back to his standing position. He almost put it back on the hook without bringing it to his ear again, but just couldn't bring himself to do it. He cast the flashlight beam on his notepad with a defeated sigh. There was one last thing he could try. 58? He asked. Or whatever you are. "I feel the pain of 1,000,000 madmen clinging clamorously to the medusoid apocrypha." I don't know if you can actually hear me, but if you are, please just listen to me for a second. We twist and turn through the kaleidoscopic horrors of black bile, yet we never look to think of what the eyeless statutes meant to tell no one. I've spent so much time trying to find out, trying to solve this. I've thrown away I don't know how many years of my life, and now whatever ones I had left when I ran into this place where you sent me. Please just tell me something, anything. Give me some kind of answer. Let me know that my work, my life had worth. Then, for the first time ever, 058 stopped talking. Conrad's breath caught in his throat. His stomach did a backflip. He thought his heart might stop. The only sound was the furious pounding of blood in his ears. And then it spoke. The sensual violence of lust is all the assurance you will ever need to know the worth of life. With all the finality of a guillotine, the line went dead. Conrad dropped the phone. He sank unsteadily to a seat to avoid falling over. He gasped a few times, like a fish, too stunned to really think about what had just happened. "Excuse me, sir," someone said. Conrad jumped. "Huh?" he cried, nearly pitching from his chair. He swung the flashlight toward the sound of the voice and found himself staring at a bright yellow shirt hanging from a flattened-looking torso. He raised the flashlight beam a bit and found himself gazing at the smooth, faceless head of one of the store's employees. Lack of mouth didn't stop it from talking, though, just as it had never stopped 058. But unlike 058, it only had one thing to say. "The store is now closed. Please exit the building." Where the blood-red journey ends. I feel a little lost, a little strange today. It had happened, finally, after a blizzard of paperwork, a long, quiet plane ride, and a dizzying orientation. James was walking the halls of Site 17, though wandering might have been a more appropriate word. Site 17 was much bigger than James had expected. There wasn't nearly enough directories, and the ones that did exist seemed to contradict each other. Either that or the newly christened SCP-2432 had messed up James's brain more than he'd initially expected. He was standing in front of one of these confusing directories when someone finally noticed his distress and took pity on him. "Hey, you need some help?" "Huh?" James asked, whirling around to face the speaker. A security guard who was now approaching. He had his visor up, revealing the face of a man a little younger than James himself. He was taller, though. Buff, too. "Do you need help?" he repeated. "You look lost." "Oh, James said, with mixed embarrassment and gratitude. "Yeah, I'm trying to get to Chemistry Lab 102B. The guard nodded. "All right, you'll need to..." He closed his eyes to think for a moment, then started pointing. "Go that way, turn left at the end of the hallway, make a right at the first intersection, go down the stairs and make another right, go around the next two corners." Then he trailed off, because he noticed the blank look on James's face. Why don't I just show you?" "Thank you," he said, smiling in relief. "No problem." Then he set off down the hall, following the directions he'd been reciting. James had to speed up a little bit to catch up with the guard's longer legs. "I guess you're new then?" the guard asked. Yeah, to this site anyway." "Where were you before?" 14, James said with as much contempt as he could muster. "Ouch, what did you do to deserve that?" "Beats me. Something in a past life, I guess." They both chuckled, a little awkwardly. The silence that followed after was even more awkward. "So," James interjected, a bit louder than he'd meant to, how long have you been working here?" It was dawning on James that he'd never actually had a real conversation with any of the security offers at Area 14. "Couple years. You like it?" The guard shrugged. "I guess. Not a huge fan of the security gig, but it's..." "Hey, Iris." "Hey!" replied a young blonde woman, heading the other direction. James didn't notice the SCP-105 across the back of her gray jumpsuit until she had already passed them. "Shit, it's okay," the guard said, putting a hand on James's shoulder. "She's cleared. Didn't they tell you that at orientation?" Feeling foolish, James relaxed. They had told him, and he was pretty sure he'd even caught a glimpse of SCP-073, who he'd heard was the biblical Cain, though he didn't buy it, on his way in. He still wasn't used to the idea of letting anomalies wander around the site, though, mostly because he still wasn't used to the idea of anomalies that weren't Class 4 biohazards. "Sorry, just coming from 14. "Yeah, I know. Most transfers take a while to adjust, but take it from me, you're safe." James looked into the guard's strong, smiling face for a little longer than was probably comfortable, until the guard noticed his hand was still on James's shoulder, and they both broke physical and eye contact as quickly as they could. The guard cleared his throat and resumed walking. "So, as I was saying, the security gig isn't too bad. We don't have incidents here very often." "Thank goodness," James agreed. The violent containment breaches were, of course, the thing he'd missed the least about ABCA 14. "I'm hoping to join a task force, though, next recruitment cycle." "Really?" "Yeah, just village idiots or something, not one of the big ones like New 7. I guess you know all about them, huh?" "I know they make a lot of noise when people are trying to sleep." The guard laughed. "Yeah, I guess they would. You won't have to deal with that around here either." "It just keeps getting better." "Yeah, you'll love it here. And here we are." The guard gestured at the door to the lab. "Oh." James turned to face his guide. "Thanks." Then he read the guy's name tag for the first time and immediately had a miniature heart attack. "Relax," the guard laughed. "He's my dad." "Oh," James sighed. "Phew, I thought this was an undercover boss thing for a second." "Nah, when you meet Dad, you'll know it." "I will?" James tried to hide his worry, but didn't succeed. "He's not as scary as he sounds," the guard promised. James nodded. That's a relief. He'd heard some pretty crazy stories about Dr. Kondraki. He didn't believe any of it, of course, but was still worried about whatever nuggets of truth might underlie the rumors. "Anyway, I'm Draven," said Draven, offering a handshake. "James," said James, taking it. "James Talleyrand." "I think I'll take a hold of whatever comes my way."